At some point in the early 19th century, roughly half of all global trade passed through the hands of a single organization. It was not a kingdom, it was not a republic, it had no electorate, no sovereign, no flag anyone was born under. It had a board of directors, a balance sheet, and a logo. A lion and a palm tree pressed into the wax of every letter it sent to every corner of the known world. The organization was called the East India Company, and at its peak, it commanded a standing army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army. Those soldiers did not swear allegiance to the crown, they swore allegiance to a corporation, to men in counting houses in London who held shares, drew dividends, and never once set foot in the territories those soldiers bled and died to hold. Think about what that means for a moment. The most powerful military force on the Asian continent answered not to a king, not to a parliament, not to any conception of national interest or public duty. It answered to a profit motive. It existed because the mathematics of return on investment required it to exist. And when the mathematics changed, it was dissolved, quietly, by an act of Parliament in 1874, as though 2.5 centuries of war, famine, and the subjugation of 200 million people were simply a business that had run its course. The East India Company is one of the most consequential institutions in the history of the modern world, and it is almost perfectly misunderstood. The standard story makes it an instrument of British imperial ambition, a commercial vehicle driven by the crown, imperialism with a merchant's face. That story is wrong in a way that matters. The crown did not build the company built itself, and it did so by following a logic that had nothing to do with empire and everything to do with the one thing a corporation is structurally required to do: return value to those who funded it. The conquest of India was not a state project. No minister planned it, no monarch ordered it. It emerged step by step from a sequence of commercial decisions made by men who thought they were solving business problems. A trading post needed defending, so soldiers were hired. Soldiers cost money, so more revenue was needed. Revenue required control of land. Control of land required the removal of whoever held it. And at the end of that chain of logic, that perfectly rational, commercially sensible chain of logic, stood an army of 250,000 men and a subcontinent in subjection. What follows is the story of how that happened, not as a tale of villains or heroes, but as something more unsettling than either. The story of an institution that followed its own internal rules with extraordinary consistency and produced consequences that no single person inside it chose or perhaps even fully understood. The East India Company was, in the most precise sense, the first corporation to shape the modern world. And what it did with that power, and what the world allowed it to do, is one of the most important questions the past has left for the present. On the last day of the year 1600, a group of London merchants walked out of a meeting with Queen Elizabeth I, holding a piece of parchment that would, 2.5 centuries later, be understood as one of the most consequential documents in human history. On that day, it was understood as something considerably more modest, a license to trade. The Queen had granted a monopoly on all English commerce east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan to a corporation called the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. The men who received it thought they were building a business. They were right. That was precisely the problem. The world those merchants inhabited was one in which fortunes from the East had begun to reshape the whole of European civilization. Spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, were not luxury goods in the modern sense. They were medicines, preservatives, the means by which meat survived winter and wealth announced itself at table. The trade routes that carried them were among the most lucrative in the known world, and for most of the 16th century, they had been controlled by the Portuguese and the Spanish, who had reached the East first and defended their position with considerable violence. English merchants had watched this wealth flow through Lisbon and Seville for decades. By 1599, enough of them had grown impatient to do something about it. What they did was structurally new. Earlier English trading ventures, the Muscovy Company, the Levant Company, the Virginia Company, had been organized around single voyages or short-term syndicates. Investors put money in, the ship sailed, the cargo returned, the proceeds were divided, and the arrangement dissolved. The East India Company was built differently. It was a permanent joint stock corporation, which meant that investors were not funding a voyage, they were buying a share in an institution. The capital they contributed stayed in the company between voyages. The company itself persisted, accumulated, and grew. The men who designed this structure in 1600 were solving a financing problem. They had no way of knowing they were also designing a new kind of power. The founding capital was £68,373, raised from 218 subscribers, merchants, aldermen, a handful of noblemen. One governor and 24 directors were elected to run the operation, accountable to the shareholders who gathered periodically as the court of proprietors to approve decisions and receive their dividends. The structure was, in its own terms, scrupulously democratic. The directors answered to the shareholders. Decisions about where to sail, what to buy, and whom to negotiate with were made by men in London counting houses, voted on by men who held certificates of ownership and expected a return. The system was designed to make money. It was designed to make nothing else. The charter itself contained a clause that received little attention at the time and enormous attention later. It granted the company the right to wage war in the territories in which it operated. The merchants who negotiated the clause thought of it as protection against pirates and rival traders at sea. The legal philosophers of later centuries would recognize it as something more fundamental, the delegation of sovereign violence to a private institution. In 1600, the distinction seemed academic. The company was going to trade in spices. It needed to protect its ships. The clause was a formality. It remained a formality for roughly 150 years, and then it became the instrument by which a subcontinent was taken. The first voyage departed in February 1601 under James Lancaster, sailing in a repurposed privateer vessel called the Red Dragon. The mortality rate for men who sailed on East India Company ships was approximately 30%. They died of scurvy, of dysentery, of fever, of storms, of the violence of rivals who had no interest in sharing the roots they had spent generations establishing. The men who signed on knew this. They signed on anyway, because the alternative was the grinding poverty of London's trades, and the company offered wages and the distant possibility of return. The institution that would eventually rule 200 million people began as an arrangement between desperate men and greedy ones, and the desperation was as structural as the greed. The Portuguese were the first serious obstacle. They had held the Indian Ocean routes since Vasco da Gama reached Calicut in 1498, and they defended those routes with warships and fortified ports and the conviction of men who understood that monopoly over spice was monopoly over wealth itself. The English company was not, in its early years, strong enough to challenge them directly. It competed where it could, fought where it had to, and sought allies wherever an alliance might reduce the cost of trade. The Battle of Swali in 1612, a company fleet defeating a Portuguese squadron off the Gujarat coast, was the first significant demonstration that English commercial ambition could be backed by English naval force. It was also the first demonstration of a principle that would define the next 2 centuries, that trade, when contested, becomes war. The governance structure in London operated on a rhythm determined by the sea. Ships left England in the autumn and returned, if they returned, 18 months to 2 years later. The directors in Leadenhall Street managed what they could from letters carried on those ships, instructions, prices, diplomatic approaches, reprimands from men who had exceeded their authority or spent more than was allocated. By the time a letter reached India, the situation it addressed had usually changed beyond recognition. The men on the ground made decisions that the directors in London would learn about only months later and ratify or reject in communications that would arrive months after that. The institutional gap between decision and oversight was, from the beginning, enormous. It grew wider with every decade. The charter had been granted for 15 years, with the implicit understanding that profitability would determine renewal. The company was, in this sense, on probation. The Crown was not investing in empire. It was licensing a commercial venture in exchange for customs revenue and the prestige of English presence in the Eastern trade. If the venture failed to pay, the charter would lapse and the experiment would end. This conditionality shaped everything about the company's early behavior. It could not afford to be idle, could not afford extended loss, could not afford the kind of patient, long-term institutional investment that might have produced a different kind of presence in India. It needed returns, and it needed them on a schedule set not by the complexity of what it was attempting, but by the expectations of the men who held its shares. By the time King James I renewed the charter in 1609, making it permanent rather than provisional, the company had already begun to understand that the East was not what the merchants of 1599 had imagined. The Spice Islands were contested ground, dominated by a Dutch competitor that was better funded, more ruthless, and more willing to use military force as a commercial instrument. India, by contrast, was a continent of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary sophistication, ruled by an empire that dwarfed anything in Europe. The company's relationship with that empire would determine the next century and a half of its existence. It entered that relationship as a petitioner. It would exit it as a ruler. The distance between those two positions was not planned. It was accumulated, one decision at a time, by men trying to solve problems that had nothing to do with empire and everything to do with profit. The company had been built for one purpose, to reach the Spice Islands. Everything else, the charter, the capital, the risk, was organized around those volcanic specks of land in the far eastern seas where nutmeg, cloves, and mace grew, and nowhere else on earth. In the markets of London and Amsterdam and Lisbon, a pound of nutmeg was worth more than a laborer earned in a month. The men who funded the company's first voyages understood this arithmetic with complete clarity. They were not interested in India. They were not interested in cotton or silk or the complex civilizations of the Asian mainland. They wanted spices, and the Spice Islands were where spices were. What they found when they got there was a problem they had not fully anticipated. The Dutch had arrived first. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, founded in 1602, 2 years after the English, was not a comparable organization. It was larger, better capitalized, more ruthlessly structured, and operated with the explicit backing of the Dutch state in a way the English company never quite managed. Where the English raised £68,000 in founding capital, the Dutch raised the equivalent of more than 6 million guilders. Where the English sent a handful of ships and hoped, the Dutch sent fleets and took fortresses. The Spice Islands, by the time the English arrived in any force, were being systematically converted from a trading zone into a Dutch monopoly, and the VOC had no intention of sharing. The English tried. For 2 decades they planted factors on the islands, negotiated with local rulers, competed for cargoes, and fought running sea battles with Dutch vessels that were usually larger and better armed than their own. In 1619, the two governments, recognizing the damage the competition was doing to both national interests, forced the two companies into a formal agreement, a treaty that divided the spice trade between them in a fixed ratio and required them to cooperate against common enemies. The agreement was negotiated in London by men who had never seen the islands they were dividing. On the islands themselves, the men who actually lived and worked inside the trading posts regarded each other with a suspicion that the treaty had done nothing to resolve. The arrangement collapsed in blood in February 1623 on the island of Ambon. The Dutch governor, Herman van Spilt, received a report that English traders and Japanese mercenaries were plotting to seize the Dutch fortress. The evidence was thin, the plot almost certainly fabricated, but van Spilt ordered arrests and interrogations that proceeded in the ruthless manner of the 17th century, employing severe physical coercion until the required confessions were produced. 10 English company employees, 9 Japanese mercenaries, and 1 Portuguese trader were tried, convicted, and executed. Their remains were made a public spectacle. Word reached London 6 months later. The outrage was genuine, and the political consequences were significant. The commercial consequences were more significant still. The English stopped trying. The retreat from the Spice Islands was not a defeat in any simple military sense. It was a commercial calculation. The VOC had more ships, more soldiers, more fortresses, and more capital than the English company could realistically match in that part of the world. Continuing to contest the islands meant absorbing losses that could not be justified to the shareholders in London. The directors made their assessment and redirected. The ships that had been sailing for the Moluccas were now pointed toward the western coast of India, toward a port called Surat, where the English already had a small presence and where, crucially, no European competitor had yet established the kind of armed dominance the Dutch held in the east. The pivot to India was not a strategic vision. It was an exit from a competition that had been lost. India, however, presented a different kind of problem. The Dutch had been beaten on their home ground. The Mughal Empire could not be beaten in any comparable sense. Because the Mughal Empire was not a trading competitor, it was one of the most powerful and sophisticated political entities on earth, and it controlled the territories the company needed access to. The English could not take what they wanted. They had to ask for it. This was a genuinely novel situation for an organization that had been built on the assumption that commercial muscle and naval force could resolve most problems. In the courts of the Mughal emperors, none of that translated. What translated was patience, gifts, flattery, and a willingness to accept a position of complete institutional subordination to a power that regarded the company as, at best, a useful minor irritant on the fringe of its vast commercial world. King James I sent a royal ambassador to the Mughal court in 1615 to formalize the company's position. The man chosen was Sir Thomas Roe, a courtier, diplomat, and member of Parliament, and his salary was paid not by the crown but by the company itself, which understood perfectly what this embassy was actually for. Roe arrived at the court of Emperor Jahangir at Ajmer in January 1616, carrying gifts that the Mughals found somewhat underwhelming: English mastiffs, Irish greyhounds, a coach that Jahangir admired sufficiently to have copied by his own craftsmen within a week, and several crates of red wine that the emperor received with rather more enthusiasm. The gap between what Roe represented and what the Mughals saw was enormous. He was the emissary of a small island kingdom at the edge of the known world, seeking trading rights from an emperor who ruled territories larger than Europe. Jahangir was not uninterested in the English. He was simply interested in them on his own terms. He asked Roe about England, about its customs, about the strange, cold island from which these traders came, and about the miniature portrait of an English noblewoman that Roe had brought as a gift, which the emperor admired so greatly that he had his own court painters reproduce it with such exactness that Roe could not tell the original from the copy. Trade agreements were a lower priority. When Roe pressed for firmans, imperial orders guaranteeing the company protection and trading rights, Jahangir assured him that such matters could be dealt with in time, and returned to the subjects that actually interested him. The 3 years Roe spent at the Mughal court produced modest formal concessions and something more valuable, a working relationship, however unequal, that gave the company a foothold it could develop. What developed it was not diplomacy, but cloth. Indian cotton, lightweight, washable, cheap enough to be worn by people who had previously worn wool and leather, arrived in England and created a demand that the company had not anticipated and could not satisfy fast enough. The directors in London, accustomed to thinking about spices, discovered that they were sitting at the edge of the largest textile market in the world, and that the English consumer had developed an appetite for Indian fabric that showed no signs of diminishing. The commodity that would sustain the company's commercial existence for the next century was not the pepper or nutmeg they had gone looking for. It was a simple piece of printed cotton cloth woven by Indian weavers who had been doing it for generations before the company was chartered, and would go on doing it long after the company was dissolved. By the 1630s, the strategic reality had crystallized. The Spice Islands belonged to the Dutch, and the English company had stopped contesting the fact. India was where the commerce was, and India was where the company would build its presence. Not from strategic planning, but from competitive failure that had redirected its energies towards something that turned out, entirely by accident, to be more consequential. The factories at Surat and the emerging settlements on the Coromandel coast were not the foundations of an empire. They were the consolation prize of a company that had been beaten elsewhere. The men running them knew this. What none of them could know was that the consolation prize was the subcontinent itself. The India that the East India Company's first traders reached was not a land awaiting discovery. It was one of the most productive and administratively sophisticated civilizations on Earth, and it had been that way for generations before anyone in London thought to charter a corporation to trade with it. The Mughal Empire, at the height of its power in the early 17th century, commanded resources that no European state could match. Its population stood somewhere between 100 and 150 million, larger than the whole of Western Europe combined. Its agricultural output fed cities of a scale that would not appear in Europe for another century. Its armies were vast, its bureaucracy meticulous, and its emperor absolute in a way that English monarchs, constrained by parliament and common law, could only contemplate with envy. The administrative structure that held this together had been built primarily by the third emperor, Akbar, who died in 1605, just 5 years after the company received its charter. Akbar had taken a patchwork of conquered territories and imposed on them a system of provincial government of remarkable consistency. The empire was divided into subas, provinces, each governed by an appointed official who answered upward through a chain of ministers to the emperor himself. Below the provinces were districts, below the districts were smaller units, and at the base of everything was the village, where the actual work of agriculture happened and where tax collectors arrived twice a year after each harvest to take the emperor's share. The system was not gentle, but it was organized, and organization on that scale was itself a form of power. The revenue that flowed upward through this system was enormous. Akbar's finance minister, Todar Mal, had developed a land survey and assessment system of genuine sophistication, classifying soil quality, measuring fields, fixing rates by crop type and irrigation status, and standardizing payment in silver currency across territories that had previously operated in a chaos of local equivalents. By the late 17th century, total imperial revenue collection may have reached 250 million rupees annually, drawn from a subcontinent that produced roughly a quarter of the entire world's industrial output. The Mughal Empire was not a wealthy place by accident. It was wealthy because Akbar and his successors had built a machine for converting agricultural surplus into imperial power, and that machine ran with considerable efficiency for the better part of a century. The merchant class that operated within and around this system was sophisticated in ways the English traders who arrived on the Gujarat coast had not anticipated. Gujarati Muslim merchants, operating out of Surat and Cambay, had dominated the middle routes of the Indian Ocean for generations, carrying cotton and indigo westward to the Persian Gulf and beyond, returning with silver and gold that fed the Mughal mint. Hindu banking families, particularly the Marwaris and the great financier clans of Rajasthan, ran credit networks of extraordinary reach, advancing capital to merchants from Agra to Malacca on the basis of instruments of exchange, hundis, that functioned like letters of credit and were honored across thousands of miles of territory without a word of English law to underpin them. The financial infrastructure of Indian commerce was, in the early 17th century, more developed than anything comparable in Europe. The Indian Ocean itself, before European dominance reshaped it, was a world of its own. Arab dhows had worked its monsoon winds for 1,000 years before Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498. The rhythm of the monsoon, the southwest wind that blew toward India from April to September, the northeast that blew back from October to March, had organized trade, migration, and empire across the entire basin for centuries. Gujarati merchants knew it. Arab merchants knew it. Chinese traders knew it. The Europeans, when they arrived, were latecomers to a system they did not build and could not, for a very long time, dominate. The Portuguese had tried to impose control through violence and fortress building. They had succeeded in disrupting the old networks without replacing them with anything that worked as well. Into this world, the English company arrived as a very minor player seeking a very limited prize. The men it sent to Surat in the early decades of the 17th century were not conquerors or colonists. They were factors, commercial agents, whose job was to buy cloth and indigo at acceptable prices and ship them back to London without being robbed, wrecked, or expelled. They lived inside the Mughal commercial world on Mughal terms. They paid customs duties. They petitioned Mughal governors when they had grievances. They sought firmans, imperial orders, to guarantee their presence in the ports, and they were grateful when they received them. The power relationship was entirely clear to everyone involved. The Emperor of Hindustan tolerated the English because English trade brought silver into the empire, and silver was what the Mughal mint ran on. Jahangir, the emperor who received Thomas Roe in 1616, was a man of genuine cultural sophistication and absolute political power. He collected miniature paintings, wrote detailed memoirs, and maintained a court of considerable artistic distinction. He was also capable of extraordinary personal cruelty when the situation seemed to call for it, and he administered an empire of 150 million people with the confidence of a man who had never seriously had to question whether he would remain in charge. When Roe presented him with English gifts, the mastiffs, the coach, the wine, Jahangir received them with interest and had his own craftsmen reproduce the best of them within days to demonstrate that the skills of his court were superior to anything the English had brought. The message was not unfriendly, it was simply honest. The structural vulnerability that would matter enormously later was not visible in the early 17th century, but it was already present. The Mughal system was held together by the emperor's personal authority and by the loyalty of the mansabdars, the nobility who held military ranks and received their income through assignments of land revenue called jagirs. The jagir system had a fundamental weakness. Jagirs were not hereditary. A nobleman's assignment expired on his death, and his heirs had to petition the emperor for a fresh grant. This meant that the nobility had no independent economic base, no territorial roots, no structural reason to hold together if the emperor's authority weakened. Everything depended on the center. While the center held, the system worked. When it stopped holding, everything the center had been sustaining would collapse simultaneously. The port of Surat, where the company established its first Indian factory in 1612, was itself a window into the world the company had entered. It was the wealthiest port in the Mughal Empire, a city of merchant palaces and crowded warehouses, of Gujarati Hindu traders and Armenian Christian brokers, and Arab ship captains and Dutch and English commercial agents, all flying their different flags from buildings along the waterfront, all operating within a framework of Mughal commercial law that was imperfect and corruptible, but functional. The Europeans at Surat were one interest group among many, and not the most powerful one. The great Indian merchants who worked out of the city controlled more capital, more ships, and more information than any European company had yet assembled. They watched the English arrive and assessed them the way any experienced commercial operator assessed a new competitor, with careful attention to what they wanted and realistic calculation of what they could threaten. What none of those merchants could have calculated, what no one in Surat or Agra or London could have calculated in 1620 or 1630, was the way the Mughal system's greatest structural strength would also become its greatest vulnerability. The empire's unity depended absolutely on the imperial center. A living, capable emperor could hold the mansabdars in line, manage the regional governors, suppress rebellion before it became secession, and maintain the flow of revenue that kept the whole apparatus funded. Remove the capable emperor, replace him with a succession of weak or contested rulers, and the centrifugal forces that imperial authority had been suppressing would surge outward simultaneously, fracturing the system into competing fragments. That fracture, when it came after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, would take less than 2 decades, and into the space it opened, the East India Company would step. Not because it had planned to, but because the space was there, and the company had soldiers. The word the company used for its trading posts was factory. It had nothing to do with manufacture. A factory was simply the place where factors lived, the commercial agents who bought cloth, negotiated prices, stored goods, and waited for the next ship. In the early decades, these were modest establishments, a rented warehouse, a handful of clerks, a small stock of silver bullion to pay for purchases, and the perpetual anxiety of men operating far from home in a legal and political environment they did not fully understand and could not control. They were guests, contingent, permitted, removable. Every agreement they held rested on the goodwill of a Mughal governor or a local ruler whose priorities had nothing to do with English commercial convenience. The first permanent fortification on the subcontinent went up in 1639 on the Coromandel coast, on the southeastern shore of India, where a company factor named Francis Day negotiated a lease of land from a local Nayak ruler, a subordinate of the crumbling Vijayanagara kingdom. The structure that rose on that strip of beach was called Fort St. George, and it became the nucleus of the city that would eventually be known as Madras. The name mattered. It was a fort first and a trading post second. The decision to build in stone, to raise walls, to install cannon, was not an act of aggression, not yet. It was a defensive reflex, the instinct of men who understood that the silver and cloth inside their warehouses made them a target, and that no Mughal governor's goodwill was a reliable substitute for walls. Bombay came to the company through a transaction that had nothing to do with commerce and everything to do with European dynastic politics. In 1661, the Portuguese king gave the 7 islands of Bombay to the English crown as part of the dowry when his daughter, Catherine of Braganza, married Charles II. Charles, who had no particular use for a cluster of malarial islands on the western coast of India, leased them to the company in 1668 for the nominal sum of £10 a year. The transaction illustrated something important about the relationship between the Crown and the company. The Crown held the territory in a legal sense, but the company was the entity with the organization, the capital, and the men on the ground who could actually do something with it. The sovereignty was English, the administration was corporate. Calcutta came last and most reluctantly. The company's agents had been probing the rivers of Bengal since the 1650s, drawn by the extraordinary productivity of the region, its rice, its silk, its fine muslins, the saltpeter that English gunmakers needed and could obtain nowhere else in such quantity. Job Charnock, the company agent credited with establishing the settlement, first arrived in the area in 1686 during a period of conflict with the Mughal authorities that ended in complete humiliation. The company's attempt to use military force against the Mughals that year collapsed so thoroughly that its factors were driven out, forced to prostrate themselves before Aurangzeb's representatives, and compelled to beg for reinstatement. They got it because Aurangzeb found their trade in silver useful and their presence on his coast manageable. In 1690 they returned, and on 3 villages along the Hooghly River, the city of Calcutta began. The humiliation of 1686 to 1690 was the most instructive event in the company's first century. It had tried, briefly and disastrously, to solve a commercial problem with military force. A dispute over trading privileges had escalated into a shooting war that the company had no realistic prospect of winning. The Mughal Empire could absorb the loss of a few coastal factories without difficulty. The company could not absorb the loss of its entire Bengal operation. The lesson that the directors in London drew was not that force was wrong. It was that force required overwhelming superiority to be useful, and that in 1690, operating on the margins of the largest empire in Asia, they did not have it. They filed the lesson away and waited. The soldiers the company employed in this period were not yet an army in any meaningful sense. They were guards, watchmen hired to protect warehouses, a handful of armed men whose job was to discourage petty theft and manage the disputes that arose in any commercial settlement between people of different nationalities and interests. The transition from watchman to garrison to army happened so gradually that no single decision caused it. Each step was justified by the previous one. The Dutch were aggressive in certain ports, so armed escorts for trade convoys became necessary. Pirates worked the coastal waters, so armed ships were needed. Local rulers occasionally needed persuading, and a show of military capacity was useful in negotiations. Each addition to the company's military capacity was a response to a specific commercial problem. No one sat down and decided to build a private army. It assembled itself, piece by piece, out of necessity. By the 1680s, the 3 settlements, Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, had acquired not just walls and garrisons, but something more significant: administrative machinery. The company ran courts in its settlements, adjudicating disputes between its employees and, increasingly, between Indians who sought the stability and relative impartiality of a known legal process over the uncertainties of local justice. It collected customs duties at its ports. It issued passes to merchants wishing to trade under its protection. These were not the acts of a trading company. They were the acts of a government, modest in scale, confined to small coastal enclaves, but structurally identical to sovereignty. The company had not planned to become a government. It had become one because the commercial functions it was performing required governmental authority to underpin them, and no other authority was available on the ground to provide it. The European rivals were a constant pressure. The Dutch remained formidable throughout the century. Though their energies were increasingly focused on the Indonesian archipelago, they had successfully closed to English competition. The French East India Company, founded in 1664 with explicit state backing from Louis XIV's minister Colbert, arrived on the Coromandel coast with ambitions that directly overlapped with the English companies. The French were better connected to their home government than the English were to theirs, and they were willing to involve themselves in Indian political disputes in ways that the company's London directors, watching from a distance of 6 months' sailing, had not yet fully authorized. The competition with the French was not merely commercial, it was systemic. Two corporate military entities competing for influence inside a political landscape that both of them were beginning to understand could be shaped to their advantage. The Indian merchants and rulers who observed this process were not passive. The great trading families of Surat and Madras negotiated with the company precisely as they negotiated with every other powerful commercial presence in their world, with attention to advantage and sensitivity to threat. Some found the company's fortified settlements useful. They offered guaranteed contracts, predictable dispute resolution, and physical security in periods of political instability. Others found them threatening, correctly perceiving that a trading company with walls and cannon was a different kind of entity from a merchant with a warehouse. The Nawab of Bengal's suspicion of the company's Calcutta fortifications in the 1750s would prove to be entirely well-founded. But in the 1680s and 1690s, the fortifications were still small enough that the threat they represented seemed proportionate to the protection they offered. What the company had built by 1700 was 3 armed commercial settlements on the edge of a vast subcontinent, a modest but growing military capacity, and a set of administrative precedents, courts, customs, passes, contracts, that had no official sanction from the Mughal Empire but functioned anyway because they were useful to the people who used them. It had also built something less tangible but equally consequential: a habit of solving commercial problems with institutional force. When trade was disrupted, build a wall. When a rival threatened, hire soldiers. When a ruler proved difficult, find leverage. The habit was not yet empire, but it was the mental architecture from which empire would be constructed, one commercial problem at a time. By the 1690s, the company had survived nearly a century of competition, shipwreck, plague, and the sustained hostility of every European nation that wanted a share of the Eastern trade. What it had not survived until now was a serious challenge from inside England itself. The threat that nearly destroyed it came not from the Dutch or the French or the Mughals, but from a faction of English merchants who had watched the company grow wealthy on its monopoly and decided that they deserved a share of that wealth. Parliament in 1694 agreed with them. A deregulating act passed that year annulled the company's exclusive charter and declared that any English firm could trade with India. After 94 years, the monopoly was gone. The directors in Leadenhall Street understood the scale of the problem immediately. A monopoly was not merely a commercial advantage. It was the structural foundation on which everything the company had built rested. Without exclusive rights to the Eastern trade, the capital it needed to fund long voyages could not be raised on the same terms. The shareholders who had bought into a monopoly had not bought into a competitive market. The company's credit with the Crown, its ability to negotiate treaties on behalf of English commerce, its standing in the ports of India, all of it depended on the legal fiction that the company was the English trade in the East, and that fiction had just been repealed. The rival that emerged from the deregulation was formally chartered in 1698 as the English Company Trading to the East Indies, the New Company, as everyone called it. Its founders raised £2 million in capital, 4 times what the original company had assembled nearly a century earlier. The government backed it with a state guarantee in exchange for a £2 million loan at 8%, a transaction that illustrated, with unusual clarity, the relationship between the English state and English commercial enterprise in this period. The Crown did not direct trade, it sold access to sovereignty, and whoever offered the best terms got the charter. The new company had offered better terms than the old one, and so Parliament had given it a monopoly over the monopoly. What followed was a period of institutional warfare, conducted simultaneously in London counting houses, in the corridors of Parliament, and in the ports of India. The old company used every instrument available to it. Its directors lobbied MPs with the dedication of men who understood that their livelihoods depended on the outcome. Its shareholders, who included a significant proportion of the new company's shareholders, since the wealthy men of London's merchant class had sensibly invested in both, applied pressure from inside the rival organization. In India itself, where both companies now had factors competing for the same cargoes and the same Mughal goodwill, the confusion was considerable and the waste substantial. The Mughal authorities watched this spectacle with a mixture of amusement and calculation. 2 English companies, both claiming to be the legitimate representative of English commerce, were now bidding against each other for imperial favor, offering competing gifts to governors and competing prices to weavers. For a brief period, this competition worked in India's commercial interest. Prices for English silver went up, prices paid for Indian cloth went up with them. But the Mughals were sophisticated enough to understand that the confusion was temporary and that a unified English commercial presence, operating under a single authority, would eventually be easier to manage than 2 rivals undermining each other. The competition resolved itself not through Indian preference, but through English political arithmetic. The resolution came in stages. By 1702, the 2 companies had negotiated a provisional merger, their interests too intertwined by shared shareholders and shared debts to sustain genuine competition. The formal union was completed in 1709, producing an entity called the United Company of Merchants of England Trading to the East Indies, which everyone immediately continued calling the East India Company because the name had accumulated weight that no Act of Parliament could reassign. The new structure consolidated the governance, 24 directors, elected annually by shareholders holding qualifying stock, running the operation from Leadenhall Street, with 10 specialist committees managing everything from correspondence to warehousing to the conduct of the ships. The merger produced an organization that was structurally stronger than either of its predecessors. The capital base was larger, the political relationships in Westminster were more systematically cultivated. The directors had learned from the crisis of the 1690s that a monopoly held only by royal charter was a monopoly perpetually at risk from the next parliament that needed a loan. The solution was to make the company so useful to the English state, as a lender, as a source of customs revenue, as the administrative arm of English commerce in the East, that revoking its charter became more expensive than renewing it. In exchange for confirming the monopoly after the merger, Queen Anne's government had extracted an interest-free loan of £1.2 million. The pattern was established. The company would pay for its privilege, and the Crown would continue to grant it. What the crisis of the 1690s had also revealed was the extent to which the company had become a political actor inside England itself. Its shareholders were not passive investors. They attended general courts, voted on resolutions, and when their interests were threatened, they petitioned Parliament, organized lobbying campaigns, and placed sympathetic MPs in positions where they could defend the monopoly. The company's political network in Westminster was not incidental to its commercial operations. It was the mechanism by which commercial operations were protected from political interference, and, when necessary, the mechanism by which political interference was directed at competitors. The same institutional capacity that would later allow the company to manage governors and Nabobs in India was first developed managing members of Parliament in London. The reorganized company that emerged from the 1709 merger entered the 18th century with a cleaner institutional structure and a considerably clearer understanding of where real power resided. The charter was a legal instrument. The army, still modest, still primarily defensive, was a commercial instrument. But the political relationships in London, the ability to shape legislation and resist accountability, the capacity to present private interest as national interest, these were the instruments that mattered most. Every subsequent crisis in the company's history, the Bengal famine, the impeachment of Hastings, the Indian Rebellion, would be managed first through the political machinery it had perfected in the struggle over the monopoly. The shareholders who fought for their dividends in the 1690s had built something more durable than a trading company. They had built a lobby, and the lobby would outlast everything else. Aurangzeb died on March 3, 1707, in his military camp in the Deccan, having ruled for 49 years and extended the Mughal Empire to its greatest territorial reach. He left behind a subcontinent too vast to administer from a single center, a treasury drained by decades of campaign, a nobility fractured by the religious and political choices he had made, and 3 sons who immediately went to war with each other for the throne. The eldest, Muazzam, won. He ruled for 5 years as Bahadur Shah I, conciliatory and competent, before dying in 1712. In the 12 months that followed his death, the empire went through 4 emperors in succession. The mechanism that Akbar had built to hold the subcontinent together, the emperor's personal authority, the loyalty of the Jagirdars, the revenue flowing upward through the provinces to the center, required at its apex a capable man. There was no longer a capable man. The machine kept running on momentum for a few years, and then it began to stop. The fracture did not happen all at once. Empires do not collapse in a moment. They collapse in a direction, and then the collapse accelerates. The governors of the great provinces, Bengal, Hyderabad, Awadh, had been appointed by the emperor to administer territories on his behalf. Now, with the emperor a figurehead managed by competing noble factions in Delhi, those governors made a calculation that every rational man in their position made. They stopped remitting revenue to a center that could no longer enforce its demands, and they began administering their provinces as if they were their own. They continued to acknowledge Mughal sovereignty in formal terms. Coins were still struck in the emperor's name, khutbahs still read in the mosques with his title, but the substance of authority had migrated outward, into the hands of the governors. Hyderabad under Nizam ul-Mulk, Bengal under Murshid Quli Khan, Awadh under Sadat Khan, each became in practice an independent state wearing the costume of a Mughal province. The Maratha Confederacy complicated everything further. The Marathas were not a Mughal successor state. They were a different kind of political formation entirely, a warrior confederation from the western Deccan that had fought Aurangzeb to something approaching a stalemate during the last decades of his reign, and which emerged from that conflict as the most formidable military power in the subcontinent. By the 1720s, Maratha armies ranged across central India collecting chauth, a tax of 1/4 of the revenue of territories they passed through, as far north as the Gangetic Plains and as far south as the Karnataka. They were not conquerors building an administrative state. They were raiders and power brokers, extracting tribute from rulers too weak to resist, and occasionally intervening in the politics of those rulers to ensure the tribute kept flowing. They were a structural feature of the new Indian political landscape, and every other power on the subcontinent had to account for them. Into this landscape of fracturing sovereignty and contested succession, the French East India Company arrived with a coherent strategy. Joseph-François Dupleix, who became the French company's governor-general in India in 1742, understood something that the English company's London directors had not yet fully grasped, that the political vacuum left by Mughal decline was not merely a risk to commercial operations, it was an opportunity. The succession disputes that broke out among Indian rulers after the death of an incumbent were not simply regional politics. They were open auctions in which European commercial companies, with their disciplined soldiers and their reliable financing, had assets that competing Indian claimants desperately needed. Dupleix began to trade those assets for territory, revenue, and political control. He backed one claimant in Hyderabad and one in the Carnatic, and when his candidates won, he extracted grants of land and revenue as the price of French support. The model was simple, effective, and genuinely new. A European trading company, by placing its trained soldiers on the right side of an Indian succession dispute, could convert a commercial presence into a territorial and fiscal one without any formal act of conquest. The victor owed his victory to French arms. The debt was paid in rights to collect revenue, to station troops, to fly the French flag in the surrendered territory. France did not need to declare itself the ruler of Hyderabad or the Carnatic. It simply needed to ensure that the ruler of those places owed France more than he could afford to refuse. Dupleix had understood that the map of India was now a negotiating table, and he had worked out the terms that suited the French company best. The English company watched this with alarm. For most of its history, it had operated on the explicit principle that political entanglement was bad for business, that the safest commercial position was one of useful neutrality, trading with everyone and governing no one. That principle had served it reasonably well when the Mughals were strong enough to make governance unnecessary. Now the Mughals were not strong enough, and the French were demonstrating that a company willing to pick sides in Indian politics could acquire, through those choices, more leverage than any amount of careful commercial neutrality could produce. The English company began to reconsider. The Carnatic Wars, the 3 rounds of Anglo-French military and political contests that consumed southern India between 1746 and 1763, were the laboratory in which the English company learned the French method and then improved upon it. The French captured Madras in 1746, demonstrating that the company's settlements were not secure simply by virtue of being English. The English and French then backed rival claimants to the Nabobships of the Carnatic and Hyderabad, each providing soldiers, financing, and political support in exchange for grants of territory and privilege. The wars moved Indian princes around the board like pieces in a game that European commercial companies had designed, and that Indian rulers found themselves playing whether they wished to or not. The English company entered the Carnatic Wars as a trading company defending its settlements. It emerged from them as something that did not yet have a name, but was acquiring the shape of a governing power. Nadir Shah's invasion of 1739 punctuated this process with a display of Mughal impotence that left no room for illusion. The Persian conqueror marched to Delhi, defeated the Mughal army at Karnal, and sacked the city with a thoroughness that included massacring somewhere between 20 and 30,000 inhabitants, and carrying back to Persia the peacock throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, the physical symbols of Mughal imperial majesty. The Emperor Muhammad Shah stood helpless. The event was watched across India by every regional ruler and every European commercial company with the same understanding. The power that had once made resistance to the English traders at Bombay a manageable exercise, and whose goodwill the company had spent a century carefully cultivating, was no longer the center of gravity in Indian politics. Something had to replace it. The question was what? The English company did not answer that question in 1739, or in 1740, or in 1745. The directors in London were still writing to their factors in India, urging caution, warning against unnecessary military expenditure, insisting that trade was the company's purpose and that political adventures would drain resources that belonged to shareholders. The gap between what London instructed and what the men on the ground were actually doing had always been wide. It was becoming wider. In Madras and Calcutta and Bombay, the company's officers were watching the Mughal order dissolve and making local decisions about alliances, about fortifications, about whom to support and whom to threaten, that the directors in Leadenhall Street would not learn about for months and could not effectively control even then. The institutional structure that had been designed for a trading company was now trying to manage something considerably more complicated, and it was not entirely succeeding. By 1750, the subcontinent that the company had entered as a petitioner seeking Mughal permission to trade had become a different place. The Mughal Empire still existed in name, and the emperor still sat in Delhi, but authority had dispersed into a dozen regional centers whose relationships with each other and with the European companies were defined by force, marriage, debt, and diplomatic cunning, rather than by any settled imperial order. The French had shown that a European company, willing to engage with this new reality, could acquire territory and revenue on a scale that dwarfed anything achievable through honest commerce. The English company had watched, learned, and begun to apply the same logic. The only question that remained, and it was not a small question, was which of the two European companies would apply it better. The answer came through Robert Clive. He arrived in Madras in the summer of 1744, 18 years old, in debt to the ship's captain for expenses incurred during a 9-month delay in Brazil, knowing no one in the city and carrying no particular qualification beyond a letter of appointment as a writer, a junior clerk, in the East India Company's civil service. His father, a Shropshire country squire of modest means and dwindling prospects, had sent him abroad because there was nothing for him at home, and because the company, whatever else it was, offered a salary and the distant possibility of fortune. The boy had shown no aptitude for study, no taste for the professions, and a consistent talent for fighting that had made him notorious in his village before his 12th year. He described himself in his first letters from Madras as the most miserable man alive. He had arrived in one of the most consequential places on earth, and he had no idea. The city he arrived in was itself a world in miniature. Fort St. George, the company's fortified settlement on the Coromandel coast, housed European merchants alongside Indian traders, Tamil weavers, Telugu merchants, and the whole apparatus of a commercial entrepot trying to function as a small government while nominally operating under Mughal suzerainty. The Europeans were a tiny minority, chronically outnumbered, perpetually anxious about the political environment beyond the fort's walls, and engaged in the intricate social ritual of company service, the hierarchy of writers and factors and senior merchants, the careful accumulation of seniority, the management of relationships with Indian merchants who were richer and better connected than most of the Europeans they dealt with. Clive spent 2 years in this world, pushing ledger entries and brooding, reading voraciously in the governor's library, and finding nothing in clerical work that his temperament could use. The French gave him his opening. When Dupleix's forces captured Madras in September 1746, Clive escaped the French captivity that briefly held him and received a military commission the following year. The transition from clerk to soldier was not, in his case, a departure from character. It was a discovery of it. He had been described since childhood as addicted to fighting, the kind of boy who organized the other boys, set the terms, and enforced them with his fists. The company's army gave him a structure in which those qualities were assets rather than embarrassments, and the political chaos of the Carnatic gave him a theater in which to exercise them. He was not trained as an officer. He had no formal military education, no experience of European continental warfare, no theoretical framework for what he was doing. What he had was an instinctive grasp of audacity as a force multiplier, the understanding that in conditions of uncertainty, the side that acts first and most decisively often wins regardless of the odds, because the odds assume an opponent who responds rationally. Arcot, in the summer of 1751, was the demonstration. Chanda Sahib, the French-backed claimant to the Nabobship of the Carnatic, had besieged the British-supported Muhammad Ali at Trichinopoly, and the company's position in southern India was deteriorating. Clive proposed a diversion. He would take Arcot, the Carnatic capital and the symbolic center of Chanda Sahib's political legitimacy, with 500 men, 200 Europeans and 300 Sepoys, and force Chanda Sahib to redirect his forces from Trichinopoly to deal with the threat. 6 of his 8 officers had never been in action. 4 of them were civilians, young company men who had volunteered out of something between enthusiasm and boredom. The plan required Chanda Sahib to respond to the threat rather than ignore it. Chanda Sahib responded. The garrison at Arcot, hearing of Clive's march through driving monsoon rain, abandoned the fort before he arrived. He walked in without firing a shot. What followed was 53 days of siege by a force that outnumbered his garrison by roughly 20-1, culminating in a night assault during the festival of Muharram, which Clive had anticipated because the attackers would be religiously exalted and therefore likely to take risks, that he repulsed with losses that broke the siege. The mathematics were improbable. The consequences were structural. Arcot demonstrated that a European commercial company, with a small number of disciplined soldiers and an officer willing to act before the logic of the situation had finished working itself out, could intervene decisively in Indian political contests. It also demonstrated something specific about Robert Clive. He had an extraordinary capacity to read what his opponents believed about themselves, and to design situations that would cause those beliefs to produce predictable behavior. He was not primarily a soldier. He was a strategist who happened to fight. The company's institutional culture in this period rewarded exactly what Clive was. The Nabob, from the Urdu Nawab, the term for a Mughal provincial governor, had become the defining figure of company service by the 1740s and 1750s. A young man of modest English origins who arrived in India with nothing, placed himself at the intersection of military force and political opportunity, and returned home rich. The accumulation of personal wealth through company service was not peripheral to the institution's operation. It was how the institution attracted the men it needed. Salaries were modest. The real money came through private trade, gifts from Indian rulers grateful for company support, and the commissions and levies that accrued to any man with military or commercial power in a chaotic environment. The company's incentive structure did not merely permit self-enrichment, it depended on it, because without the prospect of extraordinary personal gain, the caliber of men willing to endure the mortality rate and the isolation of Indian service would have been considerably lower. Clive returned to England in 1753, aged 27, with a modest fortune and a substantial reputation. He bought a seat in Parliament, lost it in a disputed election, and found that English life, the drawing rooms, the county politics, the careful management of a small estate, offered nothing that his constitution could sustain. By 1755, he was back in India, now a lieutenant colonel in the British Army as well as a company officer, with a commission that gave him authority over both military structures. The dual appointment mattered. It meant that Clive could act with the resources of the Crown's military and the flexibility of the company's commercial intelligence simultaneously, a combination that no previous figure in Indian service had been able to deploy with comparable effect. He arrived to find the situation in Bengal moving rapidly toward a crisis that would define the next century of Indian history. The Black Hole of Calcutta in June 1756 was the trigger. The new Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, young, suspicious of European commercial ambitions, and correctly alarmed by the company's continuing expansion of its Calcutta fortifications without his permission, had attacked and seized Fort William. In the confusion of the capture, an unknown number of European prisoners were confined overnight in a small cell in the fort. By morning, a significant number were dead from heat and suffocation. The precise figure was disputed almost immediately and has been disputed ever since, but the political use of the event was rapid and total. In England, the story became a symbol of Indian barbarism, of the fate that awaited Europeans who trusted to the honor of an Indian ruler. In Calcutta, it became the justification for a military response that had been in preparation since well before the cell had been filled. The company's army, commanded by Clive and supported by a Royal Navy squadron under Admiral Watson, retook Calcutta in January 1757. The military operation was not especially difficult. What came next was considerably more consequential: the conspiracy to remove Siraj-ud-Dowlah from power entirely and replace him with a candidate who would owe his throne to the company. The conspiracy was not Clive's invention. It had been proposed by Mir Jafar, Siraj-ud-Dowlah's own commander-in-chief, who wanted the Nawabship for himself and needed the company's military guarantee to take it. The company wanted a compliant Nawab, guaranteed revenue concessions, and the elimination of a ruler who had correctly identified the company as an existential threat to his authority. Both parties needed each other. The negotiation was conducted through intermediaries, the great banking family of the Jagat Seths, who financed half of Bengal's commerce and whose interests were served by a Nawab less capricious than the one currently sitting, and reduced to writing in a treaty that no one who signed it fully intended to honor. Clive was the instrument through which this arrangement was given military form. He was not uniquely corrupt, or uniquely ambitious, or uniquely willing to use conspiracy as a commercial tool. He was a man whose particular combination of audacity, strategic intelligence, and psychological ruthlessness fitted perfectly the institutional structure that needed exactly those qualities. The company did not produce Clive. It selected for him, created the conditions in which his specific character became an enormous asset, and in which the acquisition of personal fortune through the exercise of military and political power was not merely tolerated, but structurally required. The question of whether Robert Clive was responsible for what followed at Plassey is less interesting than the question of what kind of institution required a Robert Clive to function. That institution was about to collect its answer. The date was June 1757. The place was a mango grove on the banks of the Bhagirathi River, near a village called Plassey, and the East India Company was about to stop being a trading company. Bengal in 1757 was the richest province in India. Its agricultural output fed tens of millions. Its weavers produced the finest cotton muslin in the world, cloth so sheer that Mughal poets had named grades of it after running water and woven air. Its trade moved through Calcutta and Murshidabad along river networks that connected the Gangetic Plain to the Bay of Bengal and through it to every port in the Indian Ocean world. The revenue that Bengal generated was the financial spine of whatever remained of Mughal imperial ambition. It was also, since the Battle of Plassey had not yet been fought, none of the company's business. The company traded in Bengal under sufferance, permitted by the Nawab, taxed by the Nawab, subject to the Nawab's authority in every legal and administrative matter that arose within his territory. That was the arrangement. It had been working, more or less, for half a century. Siraj-ud-Dowlah became Nawab of Bengal in April 1756, aged 23, succeeding his maternal grandfather, Alivardi Khan. He was young, volatile, suspicious of European commercial power in a way that his grandfather had also been, but managed with more patience. And from the first weeks of his tenure, he made the source of his anxiety plain. The company had been fortifying Calcutta without his permission, strengthening Fort William's walls and adding cannon in anticipation of a war with France that the Nawab had no interest in being drawn into. He ordered the fortification stopped. The company's council in Calcutta ignored the order, reasoning that the French threat was more immediate than the Nawab's displeasure. Siraj-ud-Dowlah responded in June 1756 by marching on Calcutta with an army, taking the fort, and confining the European prisoners left behind in the aftermath of a chaotic British withdrawal. Many of those prisoners died overnight in a small cell in the fort. The numbers were disputed at the time, are disputed still, and were not the real reason for what followed. The real reason for what followed was Bengal's revenue. The company's council in Madras looked at what Siraj-ud-Dowlah had done. A hostile Nawab now sat between the company and the richest province in India, and understood that the situation required resolution. The resolution they chose was not negotiation. It was regime change. Instructions sent to Robert Clive from Fort St. George in Madras directed him to effect a junction with any powers in the province of Bengal that might be dissatisfied with the violence of the Nawab's government or that might have pretensions to the Nawabship. The company had been authorized to find a replacement. It needed only to identify the right candidate and make the right promises. Mir Jafar was the right candidate. He was Siraj-ud-Dowlah's commander-in-chief, a man who had been sidelined and humiliated by the Nawab he served, and who understood that his only path to the throne ran through the company's military guarantee. The negotiation was conducted through intermediaries: William Watts, the company's agent in Murshidabad, who spoke Bengali and Persian, an Armenian merchant named Khwaja Petrus, who moved between the conspirators without raising suspicion, and the Jagat Seths, the great banking family whose credit networks financed Bengal's commerce and whose relationship with Siraj-ud-Dowlah had become a source of mutual hostility. The terms were written down in a treaty signed on June 5, 1757. Mir Jafar would be installed as Nawab. In return, the company would receive enormous financial compensation, land grants, and guaranteed trading privileges. Mir Jafar would keep the throne. The company would keep everything else that mattered. There was a further complication. A merchant named Omichund had served as intermediary between the company and some of the conspirators, and he threatened to expose the plot unless he received 5% of Siraj-ud-Dowlah's treasury, a sum that would have amounted to millions of rupees. Clive resolved this problem by producing two versions of the treaty, one written on red paper that included Omichund's payment, which was shown to Omichund, and one written on white paper that omitted it entirely, which was the one that was actually signed and would be honored. Admiral Watson, the Royal Navy officer whose ships were essential to the operation, refused to sign the false treaty. His signature was forged. Clive later defended this in Parliament by arguing that it was not dishonest to deceive a deceiver. The argument was exactly as sophisticated as the situation it was describing. The armies met on the 23rd of June, 1757, on the banks of the Bhagirathi River at a place called Plassey, in a mango grove that had served as the Nawab's hunting ground. Siraj-ud-Dowlah arrived with approximately 50,000 men, 40 artillery pieces operated in part by French gunners, and the reasonable confidence of a ruler whose forces outnumbered his opponents by more than 15 to 1. Clive arrived with 3,000 men, 800 Europeans, and 2,200 Sepoys, and the knowledge that the battle had already been won in the treaty rooms of Murshidabad. The morning opened with a Nawab artillery bombardment that inflicted minimal casualties on the company forces, who sheltered behind earthworks and waited. When the Nawab's elephants advanced, British fire turned them back in confusion. When a rainstorm drenched the field, the Nawab's artillery, its powder inadequately covered, fell silent. The company's powder, better protected, kept firing. Mir Jafar's forces stood to one side of the field throughout and did not move. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, watching through the battle's turning hours, suspected betrayal but could not afford to confront it. He sent messages to Mir Jafar asking for reassurance. Mir Jafar sent reassurances. Neither man trusted the other. Neither man had any remaining options. When a Nawab officer named Mir Madan was killed by company artillery in the early afternoon, something in the Nawab's formation collapsed. Not the army, which was still vastly larger than Clive's, but the will that held it together. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled the battlefield on a camel. His forces, seeing the Nawab gone and the commander-in-chief stationary, broke and ran. The battle that was supposed to last a day was effectively over by 4 in the afternoon. The company's casualties were 22 killed and 50 wounded. The Nawab's were roughly 500. Mir Jafar arrived at Clive's camp the following morning. Clive embraced him and addressed him as the Nawab of Bengal, Bahar, and Orissa. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was caught several days later trying to escape by boat and was executed on Mir Jafar's son's orders. The payments from the new Nawab began immediately. Mir Jafar paid out the equivalent of £2.75 million to cover the company's stated losses from the fall of Calcutta. Military officers received separate personal gifts. Clive himself received a jagir, a revenue grant, worth £90,000 per year from the company's newly arranged land holdings, in addition to a direct personal payment of roughly £234,000. He left India in 1767 with a total fortune of over £400,000, equivalent by some measures to nearly £60 million today. He was 32 years old. What Plassey revealed, and what the directors in London struggled to process when the dispatches arrived, was that the company had committed an act that had no precedent in its history and no sanction in its charter. It had organized and executed a coup against a sovereign ruler, installed a replacement of its own choosing, and extracted enormous personal and institutional wealth from the process. The shareholders had not been consulted. Parliament had not been informed. The Crown had not directed it. A small group of men in Calcutta, operating on instructions from Madras that themselves exceeded any authority London had granted, had changed the political order of the richest province in Asia in the commercial interests of a joint stock corporation. The thing had been done before anyone in authority could decide whether it should be. The institutional question that Plassey opened was one the company would spend the next century trying not to answer. On whose behalf had it acted? Technically, it had acted on behalf of its shareholders. Morally, it had acted on behalf of no one beyond the men who stood to profit. Legally, it had claimed to be acting on behalf of a Mughal emperor whose authority it was simultaneously undermining. What it had not done, what it had been designed not to do, was act on behalf of the people it now governed. Bengal had 30 million inhabitants. not one of them had been a party to the treaty signed in that room in Murshidabad. Not one of them had consented to the arrangement by which their revenue would now be collected by an organization accountable to shareholders in London. What Plassey had produced was not a government. It was something that needed revenue to function like one, and that would collect revenue as efficiently as any government ever had, and that owed the people from whom it collected nothing whatsoever in return. In Murshidabad, the new Nawab sat on the throne that the company had bought for him, with its soldiers and its conspiracy. In London, the directors read the dispatches and calculated the dividends. The arrangement was working exactly as designed. The question of what it was going to produce had not yet been asked. Mir Jafar lasted 3 years. The company had made him Nawab in exchange for an enormous initial payment and a guaranteed stream of revenue concessions, and for 3 years the new Nawab attempted to meet those obligations while simultaneously discovering that the obligations were larger than the wealth of Bengal could sustain. When the company's officers determined that he was not paying promptly enough, they deposed him in 1760 and replaced him with his son-in-law, Mir Qasim. The transaction was as businesslike as the first had been: a new set of payments, a new set of revenue concessions, a new puppet on the throne. The company had installed and removed a ruler of Bengal with the administrative efficiency of a firm adjusting a contract. The implications of this, that the Nawabship of Bengal was now a position that the company created and dissolved at its commercial convenience, had not yet been fully absorbed by anyone, including the company itself. Mir Qasim proved to be a different kind of problem. He was not corrupt, not incompetent, and not willing to be managed. He reorganized Bengal's army along European lines, reformed his administration, moved his capital away from the company's shadow in Calcutta, and, most provocatively, abolished internal trade duties for all merchants, including Indian ones, because the company's employees had been using their duty-free trading privileges to conduct private commerce that was destroying Indian merchants' ability to compete. The abolition was economically rational and politically suicidal. It removed the commercial advantage that made the company's presence in Bengal tolerable to its own employees. The company went to war with him in 1763. He lost, fled, and spent the rest of his life in poverty. The lesson his experience encoded into the company's institutional memory was not a gentle one. Nawabs who behaved independently would be removed, and Nawabs who behaved compliantly could not survive the financial demands placed on them. There was no position available that worked. The coalition that formed against the company after Mir Qasim's defeat was the last serious attempt by Indian rulers in the north to dislodge European commercial power before the subcontinent was lost. Mir Qasim, the deposed Nawab, allied with Shuja-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Awadh, and with the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II himself, the nominal sovereign of the entire subcontinent, now reduced to conducting campaigns in the hope of recovering something that could be called imperial authority. 3 rulers, an army of over 40,000, against a company force of approximately 7,000 under Major Hector Munro. They met at Buxar on October 22, 1764. The coalition's problem was coordination: 3 armies with 3 commanders, 3 sets of interests, and no unified chain of command. The company's problem was simply to keep its nerve. The battle lasted a day. The coalition broke. Shah Alam II surrendered to British protection. The scene at Allahabad on August 12, 1765, was the hinge on which all of Indian history turned. Robert Clive, freshly returned to India for his second governorship of Bengal, attended an imperial durbar, a formal Mughal court ceremony, convened by the Emperor Shah Alam II. The emperor sat on whatever remained of his throne. Clive sat before him as the representative of the East India Company. And Shah Alam II, the 16th Mughal emperor, descendant of Babur and Akbar and Aurangzeb, issued a formal grant, a farman, transferring the Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa to the East India Company. Diwani meant the right to collect revenue. It meant the right to administer the finances of 3 provinces containing 30 million people. In exchange, the company would pay the emperor 26 lakh rupees annually. The ceremony had the full pageantry of Mughal imperial authority. The substance of imperial authority had just been handed to a corporation. The grant covered the 3 richest agricultural provinces in northern India. Bengal alone produced revenues that exceeded the annual income of most European states. Bihar added saltpeter and silk. Orissa added its coastal trade and its rice surplus. Together, they represented a fiscal base that would fund everything the company needed to do next: the armies, the administration, the further campaigns of conquest that were already being planned by officers who understood that Bengal's revenues, properly extracted, could pay for the acquisition of everything else. The Diwani was not a trade concession. It was a state. The company had just been handed a state by the last ruler with the formal authority to hand one, and in exchange for a sum that amounted to a fraction of what that state would produce. Clive designed what he called the dual system to manage the paradox of a trading company that was now also a government. The company would exercise the Diwani, revenue collection, directly through its own appointees. The Nizamat, the military and judicial functions of the Nawab, would remain formally with a puppet Nawab, who would receive a stipend and perform the ceremonial functions of rule while the company collected the money and made the actual decisions. The system was described as a compromise. It was, in practice, a mechanism for extracting maximum revenue while accepting minimum responsibility. The company collected the taxes. The Nawab, theoretically, maintained order. When order failed, the company blamed the Nawab. When revenue fell short, the company pressured the Nawab. The Nawab had no power to refuse either demand. He was a figurehead, and everyone, including the Nawab, understood this. The immediate institutional problem was personnel. The company had been a trading operation. Its employees in Bengal were merchants, factors, writers, men trained to buy and sell cloth, to maintain accounts, to negotiate prices with weavers and middlemen. None of them had been trained to administer a province. None of them spoke the languages of the revenue records. None of them understood the complex relationships between zamindars, cultivators, and the existing revenue machinery that the Mughal system had bequeathed to Bengal. The company solved this problem by retaining the existing Indian revenue officials, the amils and their clerks, and placing them under the nominal supervision of company-appointed deputy Diwans, who understood the accounts no better than anyone else in the organization. The revenue machine kept running because Indians who understood it kept running it. The company took the proceeds. The proceeds were enormous, and the problems were immediate. The company's employees, suddenly in possession of political and administrative authority in one of the world's richest regions, behaved as men with sudden, unchecked power have always behaved. Private trade, already a feature of company service, expanded explosively. The duty-free trading privileges that had destroyed Mir Qasim's revenue base were now turned against Bengal's entire merchant class. Company servants used their political authority to compel weavers to accept advances at fixed prices, locking them into contracts that paid a fraction of what the open market would have offered. Zamindars were squeezed for revenue arrears. The company's own revenue demands, set at levels inherited from the Mughal system, but collected with a rigor the Mughal system had never quite managed, extracted from Bengal's agricultural economy more than it could sustain. In London, the shareholders noticed none of this. What they noticed was that the company's dividends had increased substantially after Plassey, that the dispatches from Calcutta described a flourishing commercial operation, and that the directors who had access to more complete information about what was actually happening in Bengal had institutional incentives to present that information in the most favorable possible light. The gap between what Bengal was experiencing and what London understood Bengal to be experiencing was not merely a function of the 6-month mail delay. It was a function of a system in which the people with the most complete information were the people with the greatest interest in concealing it. The shareholders voted for higher dividends. The directors drew their salaries. The company's employees in Bengal continued to operate as if the world they inhabited existed primarily as a source of private fortune. What the grant of Diwani had produced, in structural terms, was the clearest possible demonstration of the argument that the video brief demands we hold throughout. The company had not set out to become a state. It had set out to trade. The accumulation of political and military power had been a series of responses to commercial problems. The Nawab was hostile, so a friendlier Nawab was needed. The friendlier Nawab was expensive, so his revenue base needed to be accessed. Accessing the revenue base required formal authority, so formal authority was sought. Each step followed from the previous one. with the logic of a commercial organization solving problems that its commercial operations had created. The Diwani was not the culmination of an imperial plan. It was the solution to a cash flow problem, and it had just handed a private corporation the right to tax 30 million people who had never agreed to be taxed by it, could not appeal to any authority that would override it, and would live for the next century with the consequences of what had happened in that Mughal Durbar on a hot afternoon in August 1765. The rains failed in the autumn of 1768. It was not catastrophic. Bengal had seen partial crop failures before, and the existing grain stores and the mobility of cultivators usually cushioned the worst effects. But in 1769, the drought deepened. By September, the wells were dry across entire districts of Bengal and Bihar. The rice crop, on which 30 million people depended for survival, failed almost completely across the most densely populated agricultural regions of the province. Reports of distress began arriving at the company's council in Calcutta. The council received them, noted them, and continued its primary work, the collection of revenue. The revenue system that the company had inherited from the Mughal administration and immediately intensified extracted 1/3 to 1/2 of all agricultural output from Bengal's cultivators. Under the Mughal system, this demand had been calibrated, imperfectly but genuinely, against the capacity of the land to produce. Remissions were sometimes granted in years of poor harvest. Local officials had discretion to adjust assessments when circumstances made the standard demand ruinous. The company system had no such discretion built into it. Revenue was a contractual obligation owed to the company on a schedule that did not vary with the quality of the harvest. The men who collected it were revenue farmers, contractors who had paid the company for the right to extract a fixed sum from a given area, and who had every incentive to collect what they had contracted to pay, and no incentive whatsoever to consider whether the people from whom they were collecting had enough left to eat. As the famine took hold through the early months of 1770, the company's council in Calcutta made a series of decisions that reveal, with terrible clarity, what the institution understood its purpose to be. In April 1770, by which point starvation was widespread across northern Bengal and Bihar, the council announced that land revenue for the following year would be increased by 10%. The decision was not made by cruel men. It was made by administrators operating within a system that measured performance in revenue collected, that reported to shareholders who measured performance in dividends received, and that had no institutional mechanism for registering the suffering of the people from whom the revenue was extracted as a fact relevant to commercial decision-making. The 10% increase was, within the logic of the system that produced it, entirely rational. The company had also, in the years immediately preceding the famine, established monopolies over grain trading in Bengal through its own agents and the Indian gomastas who worked for them. These monopolies meant that when the crop failed and local prices spiked, the mechanisms that had historically allowed grain to flow from surplus areas to deficit ones, the networks of private merchants, the bazaar trade, the informal redistribution that had cushioned previous crises, were disrupted or simply abolished. There was grain in Bengal. There was grain being held by company-connected merchants and being exported for profit, while the cultivators who had grown it starved. The famine was not created by the absence of food. It was created by the transformation of food into a financial instrument, in conditions where the people who needed it had no money to buy it, because the revenue demand had already taken everything they had. The deaths began in earnest by the summer of 1770. Contemporary accounts from company officials describe scenes of absolute devastation. Villages emptied, roads lined with the dying, and destitute cultivators sacrificing everything they held dear to pay their revenue assessments before they themselves collapsed. Birbhum and Murshidabad in Bengal, and Tirhut and Champaran in Bihar were among the worst affected. In some districts, 1/3 of the population died. Across Bengal and Bihar as a whole, the most widely cited estimate is 10 million dead, roughly 1 in 3 of the people in the affected region. Historians have disputed this figure, some placing it lower, some considering even the higher end plausible, given the absence of reliable census data. Even the most conservative estimates describe a catastrophe of a scale that had no precedent in the recorded history of the region. The company's correspondence from this period is one of the most instructive bodies of documentary evidence in the history of colonial administration. Letter after letter from district officials describes the scale of the crisis with something approaching clinical detachment, noting the depopulation of villages, the collapse of cultivation, the deaths of weavers and spinners who had no food reserves, and then pivoting in the same document to speculation about the effect on the next revenue collection. A letter from the council in October 1770 regretted the loss of what it described as numerous industrious peasants and manufacturers. Regret was the appropriate administrative register. What the letter did not contain was any proposal to reduce the revenue demand, to open granaries, to purchase grain for distribution, or to do anything that would have cost the company money in order to keep alive the people whose labor the company's revenue depended on. The loss was recorded. The lesson was not drawn. What the council did, in fact, was attempt to maintain revenue collection at its previous level, regardless of the famine. Warren Hastings, who became governor of Bengal in 1772 and would later testify to Parliament about the period, acknowledged that revenues had been violently kept up after 1771. The company's profits between 1765 and 1777 doubled, from 15 million rupees to 30 million. These numbers were not achieved by improving the productivity of Bengal's agriculture. They were achieved by extracting more from an agricultural system that the famine had catastrophically weakened, leaving behind a province with a third fewer cultivators and a third of its agricultural land reverting to jungle because there was no one left to farm it. The company collected more money from a smaller and poorer population. The shareholders received their dividends. The mathematics were clean. In London, the news of the famine arrived slowly and was processed differently by different audiences. The shareholders understood that Bengal's revenues had dipped in 1770 and then recovered, which was true in the narrowest possible sense. The company's stock price fell sharply as the scale of the disruption became clear, and by 1772 the company was in sufficient financial difficulty that it was forced to borrow £1 million from the Bank of England to cover its military budget. The crisis was understood as a financial crisis, the 10 million dead or its context, not its content. What Parliament noticed was the company's insolvency, not Bengal's catastrophe, and what Parliament decided to do about the company's insolvency was to lend it money and regulate it more closely. The Regulating Act of 1773 was, among other things, a creditor's response to a debtor who had mismanaged his assets. The moral argument that the famine demanded was made most forcefully, not by Parliament, but by Edmund Burke, who had been examining the company's Indian affairs with increasing alarm throughout the 1770s. Burke understood, and made the argument explicitly in pamphlets and speeches and committee testimony, that what had happened in Bengal was not an accident or a natural disaster that the company had failed to address. It was the predictable consequence of a system that treated the people of Bengal as inputs to a commercial process rather than as human beings with claims on the power that governed them. The famine was not the company's fault in the sense that it had intended the deaths. It was the company's responsibility in the sense that the system it had designed and operated had made those deaths structurally inevitable. Burke's distinction would run through every subsequent debate about company rule, and it is as precise and as important now as it was when he first made it. The cultivators of Bengal who survived the famine of 1770 returned, where they could, to their land. They rebuilt, as people do. They planted the following season's crop under the same revenue system that had helped destroy them. The company adjusted its collection mechanisms, retrained its revenue farmers, and continued its extraction of Bengal's agricultural surplus. Warren Hastings, aware of the catastrophe his predecessor's system had produced, built a network of public granaries across the province, the Great Gola at Patna being the most notable, specifically to prevent a repetition. It was a genuine administrative response to a genuine human disaster. It also left the revenue system that had produced the disaster entirely intact. The granaries were filled, the demand continued, The logic of extraction was not questioned. It was managed. The Bengal famine of 1770 occupies a precise place in the history of the East India Company. It was the moment at which the gap between what the institution was and what it claimed to be became impossible to ignore from the inside. The company claimed to govern Bengal. It did not govern Bengal. It extracted from it. Governing implies an obligation to the governed, some minimum of protection, some accountability for their welfare, some recognition that the power you hold over people creates duties toward them. Extraction implies none of these things. It implies only the efficient conversion of a resource into revenue. What the famine demonstrated, with a body count that even the company's own correspondents could not fully conceal, was which of these two things the institution had actually been built to do. By 1772, the East India Company was technically bankrupt. It had borrowed £1 million from the Bank of England to cover its military costs in India, could not meet its annual payment to the Crown for the renewal of its charter, and was facing a credit crisis in London that threatened to bring down several of the major banking houses intertwined with its affairs. The shareholders had been receiving dividends of 12% on the strength of Bengal's revenues. The revenues had collapsed in the wake of the famine. The gap between what the company owed and what it could pay had become impossible to manage quietly. And Parliament, which had extended the company's charter, lent it money, and collected customs duties on its imports for a century and a half, found itself in the position of a creditor whose debtor had got into difficulty through spectacularly mismanaged governance of an entire subcontinent. Lord North's Regulating Act of 1773 was Parliament's first serious attempt to impose accountability on the company, and it revealed, in its compromises and contradictions, exactly how difficult that task was. The Act did several things. It created the office of Governor-General of Bengal, giving a single person authority over all three of the company's Indian presidencies, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, rather than leaving them to operate independently. It established a Supreme Court in Calcutta, sending British judges to India to administer something approaching a formal legal system. It placed restrictions on the company's servants, prohibiting private trade, prohibiting the acceptance of gifts from Indian rulers, requiring greater transparency in the company's accounts. And it required the company to submit its correspondence from India to the government for review. These were genuine reforms. They were also, in several crucial respects, entirely inadequate. The inadequacy was structural. The Act gave the new Governor-General only one vote on his own council, which meant that a majority of 4 council members appointed in London, strangers to India, suspicious of the man they were supposed to be advising, and carrying their own political agendas, could overrule the Governor-General on any matter they chose. The first man appointed to the position discovered this immediately. Warren Hastings, who had served the company since 1750, who spoke Bengali, Urdu, and literary Persian, who had genuine intellectual respect for Indian culture alongside absolute commitment to the company's commercial interests, found that the council installed around him by the Regulating Act was determined to block virtually everything he attempted. His most bitter opponent, Philip Francis, was eventually wounded by Hastings in a duel fought on the grounds of Calcutta in 1780. The Governor-General of Bengal settled his political disputes at pistol range. The system the Regulating Act had designed was not producing order. Hastings was, by any measure, the most complex figure the company had yet produced in India. He had arrived as a clerk in 1750, the same year as Clive, and had spent 3 decades learning the subcontinent with a thoroughness that no company administrator before him had matched. He founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal alongside Sir William Jones, promoted the translation of Sanskrit legal texts, and built the Calcutta Madrasa to support Islamic scholarship. He believed, genuinely, that British governance of India should work through and with Indian institutions, rather than replacing them wholesale, a conviction that set him against the evangelical reformers and utilitarian ideologues who would later dominate company policy. He also collected revenue with ruthless efficiency, lent company troops to the Nawab of Awadh for a campaign against the Rohillas that produced accusations of unnecessary violence, and extracted money from the Begums of Awadh, the mother and grandmother of the Nawab, by means that his opponents would later describe as extortion. He was a man of genuine cultural breadth and institutional ruthlessness, and the institution he served required both. The military landscape Hastings managed was one of almost continuous crisis. The Maratha Confederacy, the most powerful military force in India after the company itself, had been drawn into conflict with the company's Bombay presidency through a combination of bad diplomacy and worse timing. Hyder Ali of Mysore, ruling a modernizing South Indian kingdom with an army partly trained on French lines, launched a devastating campaign against Madras in 1780 that brought the company's southern operations close to collapse. The French, taking advantage of Britain's distraction with the American War of Independence, sent naval and ground forces to support both the Marathas and Mysore. For several years in the early 1780s, the company faced simultaneous military threats on multiple fronts, with inadequate coordination between its three presidencies and a governor-general whose counsel was obstructing his attempts to respond. That Hastings held the company's territories together through this period was, by most assessments, a considerable achievement. It was also expensive, and the expense had to come from somewhere. It came from Bengal. Hastings returned to England in 1785 after 12 years as Governor-General. He expected recognition. What he received was Edmund Burke. Burke had been studying the company's Indian affairs for years, accumulating a command of the details, the revenue settlements, the military campaigns, the treatment of Indian rulers, the specific acts of extraction and coercion that was, by any measure, extraordinary. For Burke, the question the company's rule in India raised was not merely a question of corruption or administrative failure. It was a constitutional question of the first importance. Could a private corporation exercise sovereign power over millions of people without being accountable to any principle of justice? Burke believed it could not. He believed that power over human beings always carried moral obligations toward those human beings, regardless of where those human beings lived or what corporation held the power. He believed that Warren Hastings had violated those obligations systematically and should answer for it. The impeachment trial that opened in Westminster Hall on the 13th of February 1788 was one of the great set pieces of British political history. Burke spent 4 days reading the charges. Hastings later wrote that for the first half hour of Burke's opening address, he had felt himself to be the most culpable man on earth. The trial drew audiences that included members of the royal family, the political class, and London's fashionable society, some of whom attended as they might attend theater, which was precisely what offended Burke, who understood that 10 million dead in Bengal were not a theatrical occasion. Richard Brinsley Sheridan's speech on the Begums of Awadh was considered by contemporaries to be among the finest pieces of oratory ever delivered in the English language. The proceedings lasted 7 years. Hastings was acquitted in 1795. The Lords voted overwhelmingly in his favor. The legal grounds for acquittal were sound in several respects. Many of the charges rested on a contested reading of what obligations the company's servants owed under English law in territories governed by Indian custom. But the acquittal also reflected the political reality that convicting Warren Hastings would have meant convicting the system that produced him, and the system that produced him had been profitable enough and was entwined with enough powerful interests in Britain that the political will for that conclusion was not available. Burke predicted that the verdict would live in perpetual infamy. The verdict lived instead in relative obscurity, while the system it had declined to condemn continued operating. What the Regulating Act of 1773 had introduced, and what Pitt's India Act of 1784 had confirmed and extended, was a constitutional arrangement that would define the company's remaining 7 decades, a board of control in London comprising government ministers, with authority to review and override the company's political decisions, while the company's court of directors retained control of commercial and patronage matters. The arrangement was described as oversight. It was, more precisely, the formalization of ambiguity. The Board of Control could theoretically restrain the company from political adventures that exceeded its mandate. In practice, the board was staffed by ministers who were simultaneously managing Britain's strategic interests in India and whose definition of what those interests required was not obviously different from the company's own. The reforming mechanism and the institution being reformed were staffed by men who shared the same basic assumptions about what India was for. The deeper consequence of the parliamentary interventions of the 1770s and 1780s was not reform, but legitimization. The Regulating Act did not strip the company of its governing power. It placed that governing power inside a constitutional framework, gave it a governor-general, a Supreme Court, a board of control, that made it look like governance. The company had been an anomaly, a private corporation exercising sovereign power without constitutional basis. After 1773 and 1784, it was still a private corporation exercising sovereign power, but now it did so within a structure of parliamentary oversight that gave the arrangement the appearance of legitimacy without supplying its substance. The people of Bengal did not gain a government that was accountable to them. They gained a government that was accountable to a parliament 7 months sailing away, staffed by men who held shares in the company they were supposed to be overseeing, and whose primary measure of India's condition was the dividend the company was paying on its stock. Warren Hastings died in 1818 in the house in Worcestershire he had purchased with what remained of his Indian fortune after the impeachment had consumed most of it. He spent his final decades gardening and receiving visitors. The trial had not resolved the question Burke had posed. It had only deferred it. Whether a corporation could rule a subcontinent without owing its subjects anything was not a question that the acquittal of Warren Hastings had answered. It was a question that the next 70 years of company rule would answer in practice, with consequences that had already been demonstrated once in the fields of Bengal in the killing summer of 1770. The wealth that the company extracted from India did not stay in India. It moved in the form of silver, jewels, bills of exchange, and the personal fortunes of returning servants, along the same sea routes that had carried cloth and pepper in the other direction for a century and a half. Between the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the end of the 18th century, several hundred company servants returned to Britain from India carrying fortunes that bore no relationship to anything that could have been earned through honest trade. The process by which they had acquired these fortunes, through gifts extracted from dependent Nabobs, through private trade conducted under the protection of political power, through revenue settlements that enriched the collector at the expense of the cultivator, was understood by most of them with sufficient clarity that they preferred not to discuss it in company. The money, however, was undeniable. It built country houses, purchased paintings, endowed churches, and transformed the social landscape of middling England in ways that could not be concealed. The word for these men was Nabob, an anglicization of Nawab, the Mughal term for a provincial governor, applied with cheerful contempt to Englishmen who had returned from India so conspicuously rich that they appeared to be governing something. The term was never a compliment. It carried within it the accusation of a specific kind of moral failure, wealth obtained not through the patient accumulation of legitimate commerce, not through land, not through the honest exercise of a profession, but through something adjacent to plunder, the systematic exploitation of people who could not refuse, and an institution that would not object. The Nabob was resented for his money, for his ostentation, for his manners, and, above all, for what his money could buy in a political system that did not distinguish between wealth that had been honestly earned and wealth that had not. What the money could buy, most consequentially, was parliamentary seats. The process was direct and only loosely concealed. Borough constituencies in 18th century England were frequently controlled by a small number of voters who could be induced to support the right candidate through the provision of hospitality, cash, or the understanding that their interests would be well served. A returning company servant with a large fortune found this market perfectly suited to his needs. He had money to spend. He needed respectability and political protection. Parliament was where both were available, and Parliament could be entered by a sufficiently determined man with a sufficiently large cheque. By 1761, 12 Nabobs held parliamentary seats. By 1780, the number had risen to nearly 30. By the late 1780s, some estimates placed it close to 45. The political consequences were structural. The Nabobs in Parliament were not a coherent faction with a shared ideology. They were men who had made their fortunes through the company and who understood, with the clarity of self-interest, that what was good for the company was good for them. They had no quarrel with the company's methods in India. They had employed those methods themselves. They had every interest in ensuring that parliamentary oversight of the company remained limited enough not to threaten the system from which they had personally benefited. When Burke pressed for accountability, when reformers proposed stricter governance of company servants in India, the Nabobs were a reliable source of resistance, not organized, not vocal, simply present in sufficient numbers to complicate the arithmetic of any reform that would have impeded the flow of Indian wealth into English pockets. William Pitt the Elder saw this with characteristic clarity and said it publicly in January 1770 in a speech that named what was happening with an exactness that Parliament preferred to ignore. The riches of Asia, he told the Commons, had been poured into Britain, attended by Asiatic principles of government. Men without natural interest in the soil, without connections, without hereditary stake in the country's welfare, had forced their way into Parliament through a torrent of private corruption that no private hereditary fortune could resist. What Pitt was describing was not merely corruption in the ordinary sense, individual dishonesty, individual greed. He was describing the systematic importation of a set of institutional habits from a context where accountability did not exist into a context where accountability was supposed to be the constitutional foundation of everything. The company had no electorate. Parliament did. The Nabobs were transferring the logic of the first into the operations of the second. Beyond Parliament, the Nabobs reshaped the physical and cultural landscape of Britain in ways that were impossible to overlook. They bought estates at prices that drove up land values and provoked fury from existing landowners, who found their neighborhoods suddenly populated by men whose coaches were finer than the Lord Mayor's and whose household staffs were larger than those of the established gentry. They furnished their houses with Indian objects, textiles, lacquerwork, ivory, that established new registers of taste and new forms of conspicuous wealth. They married their daughters into aristocratic families that needed money more than they needed to inquire too closely where it had come from. Robert Clive's son Edward married the daughter of the Earl of Powys. The Clive money and the Herbert title became one entity, as they had to, because both parties required what the other could provide. There was also a current of genuine cultural exchange in all of this that sat uncomfortably alongside the contempt in which Nabobs were held. The men who returned from decades in India were not simply looters. Many of them had spent formative years learning Indian languages, engaging with Indian philosophy and literature, living inside Indian social worlds with a depth of immersion that no subsequent generation of British administrators in India would quite match. Warren Hastings spoke Bengali, Urdu, and Persian. William Jones, who worked in the Calcutta courts, founded the Asiatic Society and produced the first serious comparative analysis of Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, the scholarship that would eventually become the discipline of historical linguistics. The Nabobs brought back Indian manuscripts, Indian music, Indian astronomical knowledge, alongside their silver and their gilt. The knowledge was as real as the exploitation. Neither canceled the other out. The company itself, watching this circulation of wealth with the anxiety of an institution that needed to recruit ambitious young men into a service whose mortality rate remained shocking, understood the Nabob phenomenon as a feature rather than a bug. If men without prospects at home could return from India with fortunes that bought them into the landed class, then the company could continue to attract a caliber of recruit that would not otherwise accept the terms. The low salaries, the 6-month voyages, the probability of dying of fever in a monsoon season, these were endurable if the alternative was grinding genteel poverty in England, and unendurable if the alternative was comfort. The Nabob was the company's recruitment poster. The question of what had been done to India to produce the poster was not part of the pitch. By the end of the 18th century, roughly a tenth of all customs revenue collected by the British Exchequer came from duties on goods imported by the company. The company's operations were so deeply entangled with the British state's finances that a serious attempt to reform them would have required a reckoning with the extent to which the British economy had been built on Indian extraction. That reckoning was not made. What was made instead was a series of partial reforms. The Regulating Act, Pitt's India Act, the periodic renewal of the Charter, that trimmed the most visible excesses while leaving the underlying system intact. The Nabobs held enough parliamentary seats to ensure that the trimming was never too severe. The shareholders held enough political connections to ensure that the dividends kept coming. The system, in short, was self-protecting, and one of the most effective instruments of its protection was the presence, in the institution that was supposed to oversee it, of men who had built their own fortunes inside it. Richard Wellesley arrived in India in 1798, already knowing what he intended to do. His predecessor, Sir John Shore, had spent 5 years scrupulously avoiding entanglement in Indian political affairs, refusing to intervene in the Maratha Civil War, declining to extend the company's military commitments, attempting to honor the spirit of the Pitt's India Act by keeping the company's territorial ambitions within some meaningful limit. Shore had been recalled. Wellesley, who succeeded him, had no interest in limits. He described himself privately as a Bengal tiger, and he came to the subcontinent with the explicit intention of making the British Empire in India into the British Empire of India, a transformation that required not the cautious management of existing territory, but the systematic elimination of every Indian power capable of resisting British dominance. The justification he chose was France. Europe was at war, Napoleon had invaded Egypt with the declared intention of threatening British interests in the east, and Tipu Sultan of Mysore, the company's most implacable enemy, a ruler who had modernized his army, developed rocket artillery, built a navy, and maintained diplomatic correspondence with revolutionary France, was understood by Wellesley as the French threat's most dangerous potential instrument on the subcontinent. The argument was not entirely without basis. Tipu had written to Napoleon, had established a Jacobin club at his capital, Seringapatam, and had made clear that he regarded the defeat of British power in India as the central project of his reign. What the argument concealed was that Wellesley would have found a reason to destroy Tipu, regardless of Napoleon's ambitions, because Tipu's existence was incompatible with the kind of British dominance Wellesley had come to India to establish. The Fourth Anglo-Mysore War began in February 1799 and ended on the 4th of May 1799. British forces, commanded by General Harris, and including in a subordinate role the future Duke of Wellington, Wellesley's younger brother Arthur, besieged Seringapatam, the walled capital of Mysore, on an island in the Kaveri River. Tipu refused the terms offered, which would have left him with his throne, but without his sovereignty. The walls were breached on the afternoon of the 4th of May. Tipu Sultan was found dead in the gateway of his own fortress, his body identified by the jeweled hilt of his sword. He had been fighting personally when he died. He was 48 years old. The man who had been the most serious obstacle to company dominance in southern India had been removed, and Mysore was divided between the company, its Maratha ally, and a restored Hindu dynasty installed as a compliant replacement. The richest kingdom in South India now belonged, in all practical terms, to the East India Company. Wellesley's preferred instrument for extending that dominance without the expense of further wars was the subsidiary alliance. The concept had been developing through the late 18th century, borrowed in part from Dupleix's French model, and refined through a series of treaties with dependent Indian rulers. Under Wellesley's formulation, it became a systematic mechanism of control. An Indian ruler who signed a subsidiary treaty agreed to accept a permanent British military force within his territory, to pay for its maintenance from his own revenues, to dismiss any European officers not approved by the company, and to conduct his foreign affairs only through the company's mediation. In exchange, he received British military protection against his enemies. The protection was real. The cost was sovereignty. An Indian ruler who signed a subsidiary treaty retained his throne, but lost, in every meaningful sense, his independence. The financial mechanism of the subsidiary alliance was its sharpest instrument. The cost of maintaining the British force was set at a level that most Indian rulers could not sustain without ceding territory. When the Nawab of Awadh signed his subsidiary treaty in 1801, he was required to pay for an enlarged British garrison by surrendering Rohilkhand and the lower Doab, some of the most fertile agricultural territory in northern India. The Nizam of Hyderabad's payment, similarly, was extracted in land. The company acquired territory not through conquest, which required justification, but through debt collection, which required only a balance sheet. The rulers who signed were not deceived about the long-term consequences. Most of them understood perfectly well what they were agreeing to. They signed because the alternative was a war they could not win against an army they could not match, and because the company was careful to offer the treaty before beginning the war rather than after. Tipu Sultan had been the most visible refusal of this logic. He had watched the subsidiary alliance consume the Nizam and recognized it as the mechanism by which the company intended to absorb every Indian state without the inconvenience of direct conquest. His refusal to sign, his insistence on maintaining an independent foreign policy, his military modernization, his diplomatic outreach to France, made him, from the company's perspective, not merely a rival, but a standing challenge to the entire system. A powerful, independent Indian state was a demonstration that independence was possible, which was precisely the demonstration the company needed to prevent. Wellesley had come to India to prevent it. He succeeded. After Seringapatam, no Indian state south of the Vindhyas had the military capacity to resist the company without external assistance. And Wellesley was also eliminating the external assistance. The Second Anglo-Maratha War, which ran from 1803 to 1805, extended the same logic northward. The Maratha Confederacy, the most powerful military force in India outside the company itself, had been weakening through internal division for a generation, and Wellesley exploited those divisions with the same systematic ruthlessness he had applied in the south. The Peshwa, Baji Rao II, isolated by conflict with his own Confederates and facing military defeat, signed the Treaty of Bassein with the company in 1802, accepting subsidiary alliance status. The other Maratha chiefs, Scindia, Bhonsle, Holkar, refused to accept what they correctly understood as the end of Maratha independence and went to war. They lost. The battles of Assaye and Laswari, fought in September and November 1803, broke the Maratha armies. Delhi and Agra fell to company forces. The company now controlled, either directly or through allied states, the territories from the Deccan to the approaches of Punjab. The human cost of this expansion was felt most immediately by the thousands of soldiers and retainers in the service of the states absorbed into the subsidiary alliance system. A ruler who agreed to disband his army in exchange for company protection found himself surrounded by unemployed men who had no other profession and no other income. These men became the mercenary bands, the Pindaris, that ravaged central India through the early 19th century, conducting raids that the company used in turn as justification for further military intervention. The subsidiary alliance created the disorder that the company then used to justify its own expansion. The cycle was not planned as such, it did not need to be. It emerged from the predictable consequences of a system that disrupted existing power structures without replacing them with anything that could maintain order. Wellesley was recalled to Britain in 1805, his expansion having outrun the company's finances. The Court of Directors in London, who had been receiving dispatches about wars they had not authorized against states they had not threatened, and bills for military expenditure that exceeded anything the Bengal revenues could cover, finally exercised the oversight that Pitt's India Act had been designed to give them. Wellesley left India having added more territory to the company's holdings than any administrator before him. He left behind a company that was now the paramount power in the subcontinent, with no serious rival remaining south of the Punjab, but that was also deeply in debt, governing territories it lacked the administrative capacity to manage, and facing the consequences of a policy that had created enemies faster than it had created stability. What Wellesley's tenure demonstrated, with the clarity of a controlled experiment, was what happened when the institutional restraints on the company's territorial ambition were removed and a governor-general with a genuine imperial vision was given command. The company's internal logic had always tended toward expansion. Trade required security, security required military capacity invited political intervention. What had previously moderated this tendency was the combination of London's distance, the director's commercial caution, and the patchwork of Indian states powerful enough to make the cost of conquest prohibitive. By 1798, the patchwork had weakened sufficiently that a determined man could push through it. Wellesley pushed. The directors recalled him, but they did not undo what he had done, because what he had done had made the company richer, more powerful, and harder to constrain than it had been when he arrived. The Bengal tiger had done his work, and the company that recalled him kept the territory he had taken. The subcontinent that emerged from Wellesley's 7 years was one in which the political map had been permanently redrawn. States that had maintained genuine independence for a century, Mysore, the Maratha principalities, a dozen smaller powers absorbed into the subsidiary alliance network, had been reduced to managed dependencies or eliminated entirely. The men who had ruled them were pensioned off, their courts maintained as ceremonial shells, their armies disbanded. What replaced them was not governance in any form that the people who had lived under those rulers would have recognized. It was administration, the systematic management of territory for the extraction of revenue and the maintenance of order sufficient to protect the extraction. The company had not set out to build an empire. It had simply been unable to stop. Lord Cornwallis arrived in India in 1786 to reform a system whose failures were now visible even to the men who ran it. The famine of 1770 had demonstrated what happened when revenue collection was divorced entirely from agricultural reality. The dual system had demonstrated what happened when authority and responsibility were split between two institutions with contradictory interests. Cornwallis came with a plan that drew on English precedent: the improving landlord, the rational market in land, the private property right as the foundation of agricultural investment, and applied it to Bengal with the confidence of a man who believed that the principles that had worked in Norfolk would work in the Gangetic Plain, because sound principles worked everywhere. The plan was the permanent settlement. Its consequences would be felt for a century. The logic was internally coherent and empirically wrong. Cornwallis fixed the land revenue of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa permanently in 1793, for eternity, not for a generation, not for a decade, but forever, at a rate agreed with the zamindars, the collectors who had traditionally mediated between the cultivators and the state. The zamindars were now declared the legal owners of the land. They paid a fixed sum to the company every year, regardless of the harvest. In return, they collected rent from the actual cultivators, took their 11% share, and remitted the remainder upward. The company got predictable revenue. The zamindars got property rights. The cultivators got neither predictability nor rights. They got landlords. The Sunset Law was the sharpest instrument in the settlement. A zamindar who failed to pay his fixed revenue by the specified time on the due date, before sunset, had his zamindari auctioned to the highest bidder that same evening. The rule was designed to guarantee the company's income and to concentrate the minds of the zamindars on their obligations. What it actually did in the first decade after the settlement was cause the sale of nearly half of all zamindari lands in Bengal. The revenue had been set at a level that most existing zamindars could not sustain without either extracting impossible sums from their tenants or running into arrears when the harvest failed. The lands that were auctioned passed to a new class of owners, often company officials and urban merchants who had accumulated capital through the company's commercial operations and now invested it in land that the Sunset Law had made suddenly available. The agrarian social order of Bengal was not reformed. It was replaced. The new zamindars were frequently absentee. They lived in Calcutta or in the district headquarters and administered their lands through agents called naibs and gomashtas, whose relationship with the actual cultivators was purely extractive. The cultivators, the men and women who broke the soil, planted the seed, flooded the paddy fields, and harvested the rice, had no legal protection whatsoever under the permanent settlement. They were tenants at will. They could be evicted, their rents raised, their improvements appropriated, their children's inheritance dissolved, all within the terms of a settlement that had been designed to create a class of improving landlords and had instead created a class of absentee rent collectors who had no incentive to improve anything because the company's demand on them was fixed and they could not increase their profit through agricultural investment, only through raising what they took from the people below them. In Madras and Bombay, where the zamindari system had weaker roots, the company's administrators chose a different approach. The Reorganisation system, introduced by Thomas Munro in the Madras presidency in the early 19th century, dealt directly with the individual cultivator, recognized him as the owner of his plot, and assessed his revenue on the quality and productivity of his land. This was presented as a more equitable and more rational arrangement than the zamindari system, and in some respects it was. In practice, the revenue demand under the Reorganisation settlement was typically set at a level that left the cultivator, in normal years, with barely enough for subsistence, and in bad years, with nothing at all. The difference between the two systems was structural. The cultivator's experience of both was similar: an annual demand that could not be refused, regardless of the harvest, enforced by officials who had no institutional incentive to consider what the demand was doing to the people it was extracted from. The deindustrialization of Indian textiles was the revenue system's companion catastrophe, working through a different mechanism toward the same end. India had been the world's preeminent textile producer for centuries. The fine muslins of Dhaka, the printed cottons of Madras, the silk weaves of Benares had clothed courts and middle classes across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The Industrial Revolution in Britain produced machine-made cotton goods at a fraction of the cost of handloom production, and the company's political control of India's customs system allowed it to ensure that British manufactured goods entered Indian markets on terms that Indian handloom weavers could not compete with: low tariffs on imports, high duties on Indian exports. The weavers of Bengal and Bihar, who had already been squeezed by the opium system's redirection of their agricultural neighbors toward poppy cultivation, found their livelihoods destroyed by a combination of machine competition and deliberately skewed trade policy. They did not lose to a free market; they lost to a managed one. The drain of wealth that resulted from these systems operating simultaneously, the revenue extraction, the deindustrialization, the forced cultivation, has been estimated by economists in different ways, but the direction is not seriously in dispute. Before Plassey, India produced approximately 25% of the world's industrial output. By the mid-19th century, that share had fallen to less than 10%. Bengal, which had been the richest province in Asia, had become, by the 1830s, a province of subsistence farmers and impoverished former weavers. The wealth had not evaporated, it had moved. It had moved through the revenue system, through the trade imbalance, through the personal fortunes of company servants, through the dividends paid to shareholders in London, and through the purchase of goods and services in Britain that the wealth of India made possible. The drain was not a conspiracy, it was a system, and the system worked exactly as it was designed to. The recurrence of famine under company rule was the most visible evidence that the revenue machine had not been adjusted to reflect the limits of what the agricultural economy could sustain. The 1901 Famine Commission, reviewing the period of company rule that had ended in 1858, found that 12 major famines and 4 severe scarcities had occurred in the 93 years between 1765 and 1858. This was not the historical pattern of Indian agriculture, which had experienced local famines under Indian rulers, but never on this frequency or geographic scale. The pattern of colonial famine was different in character from the pattern of pre-colonial famine, broader in geographic scope, more lethal in outcome, more directly connected to the revenue demand that continued in bad years as in good. The company did not cause the droughts. It caused the mechanism by which droughts became famines. Cornwallis had designed the permanent settlement in the genuine belief that it would produce the same results in Bengal that enclosure and improving landlordism had produced in England: capital investment in land, rising productivity, a prosperous tenantry, stable revenue. He was wrong not because the idea was foolish in its own terms, but because the conditions it assumed, a landlord with security of tenure, capital to invest, and incentive to improve, did not exist in Bengal and were not created by the settlement. What the settlement created instead was a landlord class with legal ownership, company obligation, and no interest in the land beyond extracting from it as much rent as the law permitted. The theory was English, the practice was Bengal, and Bengal was not England in any of the ways that mattered to the theory's success. The revenue machine ran on. New settlements were made, revised, extended to new territories as the company's conquests expanded the territory it needed to tax. The Mahalwari system covered the Gangetic Plain. The Rayatwari system covered Madras and eventually Bombay. Each system had its advocates among the company's administrators, its own theoretical justification, its own claim to represent an improvement on what had come before. What they shared was the fundamental structure they had inherited from the permanent settlement, a revenue demand that did not flex with agricultural conditions, enforced by officials whose institutional obligation was to the company's balance sheet and whose relationship with the cultivators was mediated only by the law. The debate among administrators about which system was more equitable was real and sometimes sophisticated. The cultivators who lived under all three systems understood something simpler. The demand came every year. The harvest was uncertain, and the gap between them was their problem to resolve. By the 1830s, the revenue systems of British India had achieved something that no previous conquest in Indian history had managed. They had converted the land itself from a productive asset, cultivated and managed within a complex web of customary rights and obligations stretching back generations, into a financial instrument whose primary purpose was to generate returns for an institution 7,000 miles away. The cultivator had been transformed from a participant in a system of customary obligation into a payer of rent. The land had been transformed from a commons, in the widest sense, a resource managed by a community for the community's survival, into property, which could be bought, sold, mortgaged, and auctioned, and which would be, whenever the harvest failed and the rent came due, exactly that. The problem was silver. China had everything that Britain wanted: tea, silk, porcelain. And Britain had very little that China wanted in return. English wool sat unsold in Canton warehouses. British manufactured goods found no market in an empire that produced its own superior equivalents of almost everything the English could offer. The only currency the Chinese merchant system would accept for its goods was silver, and silver was scarce in Britain, persistently outflowing to Asia in exchange for commodities that the British consumer had developed an apparently insatiable appetite for. By the late 18th century, the East India Company's China trade was a structural problem. The more tea it imported, the more silver it needed, and the more silver it sent to China, the less it had available for everything else. The company needed a commodity that China would buy, and it needed one urgently. The commodity existed. It grew in the poppy fields of Bihar and the Gangetic Plain, had been cultivated in India since Mughal times, and produced a resin that, when processed and dried into cakes, was one of the most tradable goods in the world: opium. The company had inherited the Mughal opium monopoly along with the Diwani of Bengal, and Warren Hastings had formalized it in 1773, abolishing the existing opium syndicate at Patna and establishing the company's exclusive control over cultivation, processing, and sale across the Bengal and Bihar provinces. For the next 50 years, no poppy could be grown in these territories without the company's permission. No opium could be processed outside its licensed factories, and no opium could be sold except through its Calcutta auction houses, where the product was packaged into standardized chests and sold to private merchants who then transported it to China. The farmers who grew the poppies did not choose to grow them. The company's system of advance payments, advances given to cultivators at the beginning of the planting season, binding them to deliver a fixed quantity of raw opium at a price set by the company's opium department, was designed to guarantee supply and to ensure that the cultivators remained locked into poppy cultivation season after season. The advances were often inadequate, the prices fixed below what the open market would have paid, and the penalties for non-delivery severe. A farmer who accepted an advance and then failed to produce the contracted quantity because the monsoon had been poor or the crop had failed could find himself in debt that carried forward to the next season and the season after that, compounding in the way that debts compound when the creditor also controls the law. The system produced opium reliably and at minimum cost. That was what it had been designed to do. The opium moved from the Calcutta auction houses to the coast of China via a mechanism the company had designed to maintain a degree of legal distance from a trade that was prohibited under Chinese law. The company itself did not transport opium to China. It sold the drug at Calcutta to licensed private merchants, the country traders, many of them operating out of Bombay, some of them British, some Indian, some Parsi, who then shipped it to the anchorages off the southern Chinese coast. There, Chinese smugglers carried it inland for distribution. The company's hands were clean in the technical sense that its ships carried no opium. The company's ledgers recorded the revenue from the Calcutta auctions. The distinction between the two was not moral, it was administrative. The scale of the trade grew with the appetite it was feeding. In 1773, when Hastings formalized the monopoly, perhaps a few hundred chests of opium reached China annually. By 1800, the figure was around 4,000 chests per year. By 1838, on the eve of the First Opium War, it had reached 40,000. Each chest weighed approximately 140 pounds and contained processed opium sufficient to sustain the addiction of a considerable number of people through a considerable period. The growth in the trade was not driven by increasing Chinese demand for recreation. It was driven by the structural imperatives of the company's balance sheet. The more tea the company needed to import, the more opium revenue it required to fund those imports, and the more opium revenue it required, the more aggressively the Calcutta auction houses needed to supply the trade. The drug was not a byproduct of the China trade. By the early 19th century, it was the China trade's engine. The social consequences in China accumulated over decades before the Qing government recognized them as a crisis. Opium addiction among the scholar official class had been documented since the 1790s. By the 1820s, it had spread through the cities, among merchants, soldiers, and government functionaries, and was beginning to penetrate rural communities. By the 1830s, informed estimates placed the number of regular opium users in China in the millions, and the outflow of silver to pay for the drug had reversed the trade balance that had previously favored China. Silver that had flowed into China for centuries was now flowing out, destabilizing the Qing currency system and creating the monetary conditions for economic disruption at a scale that the Qing administration had no precedent for managing. The Daoguang emperor understood by the mid-1830s that the opium trade was destroying something more than individual human beings. It was destroying the fiscal and social infrastructure of his state. The Qing government's attempts to suppress the trade placed it in direct confrontation with the company's commercial imperatives, and ultimately with the British state. Lin Zexu, the imperial commissioner dispatched to Canton in 1839 to end the trade, seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium belonging to British merchants, a calculated act of sovereign authority over a commerce conducted illegally within Chinese territory. The British government responded by going to war. The First Opium War, fought from 1839 to 1842, ended in Chinese defeat in the Treaty of Nanjing. China ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened 5 additional ports to British trade, paid a large indemnity, and was compelled to legalize the opium trade. The war had been fought to compel a sovereign state to permit the import of a drug whose domestic sale was prohibited, a proposition so naked in its logic that even some of the company's defenders in Parliament found it difficult to defend without flinching. The opium system illuminates the company's institutional ethics with particular clarity because it was the one area of its operations in which the conflict between commercial interest and human consequence was most starkly visible, and most consistently resolved in favor of commercial interest. The company's officials knew what addiction was. They had seen it in China, had read the Qing government's communications about its scale, had access to the reports of missionaries and traders who described what opium dependency was doing to Chinese communities. None of this knowledge produced a change in policy. The Calcutta auction houses continued to operate. The Bengal and Bihar cultivators continued to receive their advances. The country traders continued to sail to the Canton anchorages. The opium trade continued because the company's revenue from it continued, and the company's revenue from it was, by the early 19th century, approaching 17% of the total revenue of British India. To end the trade would have required finding 17% of India's revenue from some other source. The company did not look for that source. For the Bengali and Bihari cultivators who grew the poppies, the opium system compounded the effects of the revenue machine they were already living under. Agricultural land that might have grown rice or lentils or vegetables, food for the cultivator's family and surplus for the market, was growing poppies instead, for a price that the company set and that the cultivator could not refuse. The regions most intensively converted to poppy cultivation were among the regions most vulnerable to food shortages when the monsoon failed, because the land that might have grown food had been redirected toward a crop whose market was not local and whose benefit accrued entirely elsewhere. The connection between the opium system and the recurrence of famine in the Bihar districts was not theoretical, it was agronomic. The company's monopoly on opium was formally broken in 1834, when the Charter Act of the previous year stripped it of its remaining commercial privileges. The trade did not end, it expanded, as private merchants freed from the company's auction system competed aggressively for market share and drove prices down to levels that made addiction accessible to a broader segment of Chinese society. The liberalization of the opium trade was one of the great demonstrations of the period that free markets could produce worse outcomes than monopoly, given sufficient indifference to the humanity of the people the market was operating on. The Qing government's final attempt to suppress it produced the war that produced the unequal treaties that produced a century of Chinese humiliation that the People's Republic of China still describes in those precise terms today. The chain from the Calcutta auction houses to that century of consequence is unbroken and direct. The East India Company had been born as a monopoly and had held that monopoly against sustained assault for 2 centuries. The monopoly was not merely a commercial advantage. It was the company's legal identity, the thing that made it the company rather than just another trading venture. To be the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies was to be the only entity in England legally permitted to trade with half the world. Every charter renewal since 1600 had confirmed this. The Charter of 1793 extended it for another 20 years. When that 20 years expired in 1813, Parliament declined to extend it on the same terms. The monopoly over India, over the roots, over the goods, was broken. The East India Company was still the government of a subcontinent. It was no longer the only merchant allowed to trade with one. The arguments that dismantled the monopoly were not primarily moral. They were economic, and they were made by men who had been reading Adam Smith with the attention that ideas receive when they coincide with self-interest. British manufacturers had survived Napoleon's continental system, which blocked British goods from European markets, by looking eastward. India, with its population of 150 million, was the largest potential consumer market in the world, and British machine-made cotton goods were now cheap enough to undercut Indian handloom production at almost every price point. The manufacturers wanted access. The company's monopoly was standing in their way. Parliament, whose relationship with industrial capital was becoming the defining political fact of the age, gave them what they wanted. The Charter Act of 1813 broke the Indian trade monopoly while preserving the China tea monopoly and the opium trade, which were too profitable to sacrifice to ideology. British merchants could now trade with India under a licensing system. Missionaries could enter the company's territories, a provision extracted by the evangelical lobby that had been pressing for a generation. The Crown's sovereignty over all company territories was formally asserted for the first time in statute, making explicit what had been implicit since the grant of Diwani in 1765. The company held India on behalf of the Crown, not in its own right. 1 lakh of rupees annually was allocated for Indian education, a sum so small relative to the territory it was supposed to improve that its primary significance was symbolic, a gesture toward the idea that the company had some obligation to the people it governed without constituting any serious effort to discharge it. The practical consequences of opening India to free trade arrived faster than anyone had predicted and produced consequences more severe than most had intended. Between 1813 and 1833, British exports to India increased tenfold. The machine-made cotton goods that flooded Indian markets at prices Indian handloom weavers could not match accelerated a process of deindustrialization that the company's own commercial policies had already begun. Dhaka muslin, the finest cotton fabric ever woven by human hands, so sheer that Mughal emperors had named grades of it after running water, effectively ceased to exist as a commercial product within a generation of the charter change. The looms went silent not because the weavers lacked skill, but because the market for their skill had been systematically undersold by machines operating in Lancashire mills on cotton grown partly in India itself. The Charter Act of 1833 completed what 1813 had begun. The remaining commercial monopolies, the China tea trade, the last vestige of the company's original commercial identity, were abolished. The company was stripped of all trading functions. It retained its administrative and military role, it still governed the subcontinent, still commanded its armies, still collected its revenues, still appointed its civil servants, and sent its instructions from Leadenhall Street. But it was no longer a trading company in any meaningful sense. It was a managing agency, a body contracted by the Crown to administer territories the Crown nominally owned, funded by revenues extracted from those territories, answerable to a board of control that Parliament had created to oversee it. The institution that had been chartered to trade in spices had become, in the terminology of its own time, a colonial government. The shareholders adjusted to this transformation with the pragmatism of people whose fundamental interests had not changed. The 1833 Act guaranteed them a dividend of 10.5% annually for 40 years, to be funded not from commercial profits, there were none left, but from Indian revenues. The people of India were now paying the dividends of a company whose commercial operations had been abolished by an act of the British Parliament. The arrangement was understood by no one as grotesque because the arrangement was a financial instrument rather than a moral category, and financial instruments are easier to inhabit without examining. The identity crisis that the 1833 Act produced within the company's own administration was real and is worth pausing on. The men who ran the company in the 1830s and 1840s had joined a commercial enterprise. They had trained, in many cases, through a commercial education. They understood themselves as merchants, as administrators of a trading operation, as servants of an institution whose purpose was to generate return for shareholders through the management of commerce. The commerce was now gone. What remained was power. Territorial, administrative, military power on a scale that no commercial institution had ever held, exercised without the commercial rationale that had originally justified its accumulation. The company had not set out to become a government. Having become one, it found itself without a compelling account of why that was appropriate, or what obligations it entailed, or who it was ultimately responsible to. The period between 1813 and 1833 was also the period in which the great debate about what British rule in India was for, the debate between Orientalists, who argued that Indian institutions and knowledge should be respected and preserved, and Anglicists, who argued that English education and English institutions should replace them, reached its decisive, if temporary, resolution. Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Education of 1835, written in the immediate aftermath of the 1833 Act, declared with his characteristic confidence that a single shelf of good European literature was worth the entire literatures of India and Arabia combined, and that the proper purpose of Indian education was to produce a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and intellect. The Minute was not an act of Parliament, but it shaped Indian education policy for generations. It was also the clearest possible statement of what the post-1833 company understood its mission to be. Not commerce, not even administration in the neutral sense, but cultural transformation. The managing agency had become a civilizing project, whether India wished to be civilized or not. James Andrew Brune Ramsay, the first Marquess of Dalhousie, arrived in India in January 1848, aged 36, the youngest Governor-General the company had ever appointed. He was a man of considerable administrative energy, genuine conviction in the superiority of British governance, and an impatience with the tolerances and accommodations that his predecessors had used to manage the patchwork of Indian sovereignty that still existed within the company's orbit. He had been president of the Board of Trade before coming to India. He thought about the subcontinent the way an efficient administrator thinks about an inheritance that has been badly managed. There was too much waste, too many redundant structures, too many arrangements that made no rational sense. He proposed to rationalize them. The doctrine of lapse was the instrument Dalhousie chose for the most consequential of these rationalizations. Its logic was simple, and it built on a concept that the company had been developing since the 1830s, the principle of paramountcy, by which the company claimed, as the supreme power on the subcontinent, the right to approve and regulate the succession of Indian princely states that existed within its sphere. Under existing Indian law and custom, a ruler without a natural male heir could adopt a son, who would inherit his throne and his titles. The doctrine of lapse held that the company, as paramount power, had the right to refuse to recognize such adoptions, and that a state whose ruler died without a natural male heir, and whose adoption the company declined to sanction, would lapse into direct company administration. The doctrine was not entirely Dalhousie's invention, but he applied it with a thoroughness that made it his defining legacy. Satara fell first in 1848. The Raja had died without a natural heir and had adopted a son in the days before his death. Dalhousie refused to recognize the adoption. The state was annexed. Jaitpur and Sambalpur followed in 1849, Bhagat in 1850, Udaipur in 1852, Jhansi in 1853, Nagpur in 1854. Each annexation followed the same procedural logic: no natural male heir, adoption not recognized, territory absorbed into direct company administration. In aggregate, these annexations added hundreds of thousands of square miles and millions of pounds annually to the company's revenues. The justification in each case was the same. So was the effect. A ruler who had held sovereign authority, whose court had maintained an aristocracy, whose army had given employment to thousands of soldiers, was replaced by a company collector. The court was dissolved, the army was disbanded, the aristocracy had no function. Jhansi was the annexation that would matter most in the reckoning that came 3 years later. The Raja of Jhansi had died in November 1853, leaving an adopted son, the adoption made with the explicit approval, or so the Rani Lakshmibai believed, of the British resident at her court. Dalhousie refused it. Lakshmibai wrote a personal petition to the Court of Directors in London. "My husband trusted the British government," she told them, "and I, too, trust it, and it is not just that such an adoption, made with the approval of the political agent, should be disregarded." The directors did not reverse the decision. The pension that had been promised for the maintenance of the late Raja's household was reduced and then delayed. The state was absorbed. The Rani's court, her attendants, her soldiers, her entire world of obligation and custom was dissolved by administrative fiat from a man who had never visited her city. Awadh was different in mechanism but identical in effect. The Nawab of Awadh had been a British ally for a century. The state had signed a subsidiary treaty in 1801 and had maintained it through every subsequent crisis. Awadh's treasury had financed British military operations. Awadh's territory had served as a buffer state protecting the company's northern frontier. Awadh's revenue had underwritten the company's Bengal operations in years when those operations ran short. The Nawab in 1856, Wajid Ali Shah, had a natural heir. The doctrine of lapse did not technically apply. Dalhousie annexed it anyway, on the grounds of misgovernance, a charge that was partially true, partially manufactured, and entirely convenient. The annexation added £4 million annually to the company's revenues. It also injected into the Bengal army a population of soldiers who were predominantly recruited from Awadh and who had, until February 1856, served a sovereign to whom they owed personal loyalty. That sovereign was now gone. The railways and telegraphs that Dalhousie built across the subcontinent in this same period are usually discussed separately from his annexation policy, as evidence that he was a genuine modernizer alongside being an aggressive imperialist. The separation is misleading. The railway lines that connected Calcutta to Bombay, Bombay to Thane, the coal fields of Raniganj to the Bengal presidency, were built with Indian revenue and designed to serve the extraction logic that the revenue machine had always operated on, moving goods from the interior to the ports, moving troops from the ports to the interior, moving cotton and saltpeter and indigo from the fields to the ships, with a speed and volume that bullock carts could not match. The telegraph lines served the same dual purpose: military communication in one direction, commercial information in the other. Modernization and extraction were not contradictory impulses in Dalhousie's India. They were the same impulse expressed through different instruments. The accumulated grievances that Dalhousie's 8 years produced were not yet an uprising. They were a pressure, unvoiced, widely distributed across classes and communities and regions, that had no mechanism for coordinated expression and that had not yet found the specific occasion that would crystallize everything into action. Dispossessed rulers, their aristocracies idle and resentful. Former soldiers of the annexated states, unemployed and embittered. Zamindars who had lost land under the revenue settlements and attributed their loss to the company's system. Weavers ruined by machine cotton. Cultivators pressed beyond endurance by revenue demands that did not flex with the harvest. These were not groups that spoke to each other. They shared no ideology, no organization, no common language of grievance beyond the fact that the company had disrupted, in some fundamental and irreversible way, the world they had known. The disruption was not yet a rebellion. It was an accumulation. Dalhousie left India in February 1856, his health destroyed by 8 years of tropical service, his administrative record by any conventional measure extraordinary. He had extended the railway to 1,000 miles of track. He had created a unified postal system. He had introduced the telegraph and instituted strict legal prohibitions against lethal customary practices targeting widows and infants. He had also annexed 250,000 square miles of Indian territory, dissolved a dozen royal courts, disbanded tens of thousands of soldiers, denied the thrones and pensions of adopted heirs, and removed from power a century-old British ally without a legal pretext that his own predecessors would have recognized as adequate. He left India having extracted more from it and destabilized more of it than any governor-general before him. The 1857 rebellion began 14 months after he sailed. The doctrine of Lapse, considered as a policy, was the clearest expression of what the company had become in its final phase, an institution confident enough in its own authority and its own superiority to dispense with the forms of consent and reciprocity that even the most cynical of its earlier officers had understood were necessary for stable governance. The subsidiary alliance, for all its exploitation, had been an agreement, something both parties signed, even if the terms were dictated by the stronger. The doctrine of Lapse required no agreement. It required only the death of a ruler without a son and a governor-general willing to act on the logic of paramountcy without the patience to negotiate the human consequences. The company had absorbed its final territories not through war, not through conspiracy, not through the manipulation of succession disputes that had served it so well since Plassey, but through administrative decree. It had stopped pretending that its power required any legitimacy beyond itself. In the summer of 1856, with Dalhousie gone and his successor Lord Canning newly arrived, the subcontinent that the East India Company had spent 2 centuries assembling was as large as it would ever be. It was also more fragile than it had been at any point since Plassey, because the accumulation of grievance that a century of extraction had produced had finally reached the layer of the company's own army, the Sepoys of the Bengal presidency, drawn disproportionately from Awadh, many of them personally connected to families dispossessed by the annexations, all of them subject to the same evangelical and utilitarian pressures that the new generation of company administrators applied without the cultural sensitivity that Hastings and Monroe and Jones had brought to the same questions 50 years earlier. The company had, in its final phase, managed to unite in resentment of it the very population it most needed to remain loyal. What came next was not inevitable, but it was very close. The company's army was not, by the mid-19th century, an army in the sense that a European nation understood the term. It was 3 armies, one for each presidency, Bengal, Madras, Bombay, each with its own command structure, its own regiments, its own culture, and its own relationship to the society from which it drew its soldiers. The Bengal army was the largest, the most prestigious, and the most deeply embedded in the caste and community structures of the Gangetic Plain. By 1857, it numbered approximately 159,000 soldiers, of whom more than 135,000 were Indian. The European soldiers, officers and men, were a thin layer over a mass of Indian military power that the company had spent a century training, equipping, and deploying, and on which every expansion of its territory had depended. The ratio of Indian to European soldiers in the Bengal army was approximately 7-1. The company that ruled 200 million people did so primarily through the military labor of those people's countrymen. The Bengal army's recruitment was not random. It was deliberate, systematic, and socially specific. The company had made a decision in the late 18th century to recruit its Bengal infantry predominantly from high caste Hindu communities, Brahmins and Rajputs, drawn mainly from the districts of Bihar and Awadh. The reasoning was partly military. These men were regarded by British officers as physically imposing, martial by tradition, and amenable to the discipline of European-style infantry warfare. The reasoning was also political. Men of high caste had social honor to protect, and social honor was a more reliable motivator than wages alone. A sepoy who had staked his caste standing on his military service was less likely to desert, less likely to mutiny, more likely to fight with the consistency that long campaigns required. The company got the army it calculated it needed. It also got an army whose members had a very specific relationship to caste, community, and religion, a relationship that would matter enormously when the company began to treat those things as problems to be solved rather than realities to be accommodated. The accommodation of caste and religion within the Bengal army had been, for most of its history, genuine rather than perfunctory. Regiments were recruited from single communities, same caste, same village, often same family, which meant that the social bonds holding them together were thicker than military loyalty alone. Soldiers were permitted to observe their caste dietary restrictions. Brahmin soldiers were not required to perform tasks that violated their ritual status. Muslim soldiers observed Ramadan. Hindu soldiers were not compelled to cross the Black Water, the seas beyond India, which many high caste Hindus believed would destroy their ritual purity. These accommodations were not acts of generosity, they were acts of calculation. The company understood that an army composed of men whose religious and caste identities had been deliberately respected was an army that would fight. Disrupting those accommodations carried institutional risks that most company officers understood clearly. The British officers who commanded the sepoys occupied a peculiar position. They outranked every Indian officer, regardless of seniority or experience. An Indian officer who had served for 30 years could not give an order to a newly arrived British subaltern who had served for 30 days. No Indian could hold a commission as an officer in the European regiments. The ceiling on Indian advancement was absolute, and was not the result of individual commanders' prejudices, but of institutional policy that had been formalized in 1765 and never seriously revisited. The officers who served in the sepoy regiments were, in the earlier generations, often men of genuine cultural engagement, men who learned the languages of their soldiers, who ate with them, who understood their concerns, and communicated through those concerns with something approaching mutual respect. By the 1840s and 1850s, this was increasingly not the case. A generation of officers shaped by evangelical Christianity and utilitarian reformism had arrived with the conviction that Indian customs were not realities to be accommodated, but superstitions to be corrected. The cultural distance between officers and soldiers that had opened by the 1850s was not simply a matter of individual attitude. It was the product of a broader shift in how the company's educated class understood its mission in India. The 1813 Charter had permitted missionaries. Macaulay's 1835 Menu had mandated English education. The evangelical lobby within Parliament and the Court of Directors had spent decades arguing that British rule in India carried an obligation to bring civilization, meaning Christianity, meaning English law, meaning Western social norms, to a population that British administrators increasingly described as primitive, superstitious, and mired in practices that sound government should abolish. Widow immolation had been banned. Tagi, the practice of ritual murder, had been suppressed. These were not in themselves indefensible interventions, but they were part of a broader pattern in which the company's relationship to Indian culture had shifted from the measured engagement of Hastings's generation to something that looked, from inside the Bengal Army's regiments, like systematic contempt. The soldiers felt this shift through the texture of their daily service. The requirement, introduced in 1856, that all new recruits sign a general service commitment, agreeing to serve overseas if required, struck directly at the caste restrictions that had previously exempted Brahmin and Rajput soldiers from crossing the sea. The expansion of the Bengal Army's area of operations into Burma and Afghanistan, which required extended service far from home in conditions that violated caste ritual in innumerable small ways, had been accumulating grievance for a decade. The reduction of the Foreign Service Allowance, the extra pay that had compensated soldiers for service beyond India's traditional borders, removed a financial accommodation that officers had previously judged prudent to maintain. Pay was irregular in some units. Promotion was blocked absolutely at the racial ceiling. The army that had been designed as an instrument of loyalty was experiencing the slow accumulation of reasons to reconsider. The Sepoys understood their institutional power better than the company gave them credit for. In an army where Indians outnumbered Europeans 7-1, and where the European regiments were scattered and undermanned, the mathematics of potential resistance were not obscure. What had prevented that potential from becoming actual for a century was the combination of the social accommodations that made service tolerable, the institutional loyalties that made the regiment a community worth defending, and the absence of a sufficiently universal grievance that could unite men who were separated by caste, religion, region, and language. The company's final years in India were a systematic dismantling of the first two conditions, without any compensating change in the third. The grievances were accumulating. The accommodations were eroding. The institution had begun, in effect, to persuade the instrument of its control that the instrument had reasons to rebel. The company's assumption that the Bengal Army was a reliable instrument of corporate control was not irrational. It had held for a century. The Vellore Mutiny of 1806, in which some Madras sepoys had briefly revolted over changes to dress and equipment that they understood as religious interference, had been quickly suppressed and quickly forgotten. The lessons it offered about the limits of institutional patience with cultural accommodation had not been absorbed with any great thoroughness. By 1857, the assumption of reliability was an institutional habit rather than a considered assessment. A belief maintained not because it had been recently tested, but because it had not recently been tested, which is a different and considerably more dangerous thing. What came next would test it decisively, and would discover that the assumption was wrong. In the cantonment towns of northern India, in the winter of 1856 and the spring of 1857, something was moving through the Bengal Army that the company's intelligence network either could not detect or chose not to interpret as the threat it was. Chapatis were being passed from village to village across Awadh in a pattern that no one could quite decode. Rumors were circulating through the regiment lines about the new Enfield rifle cartridges, that they were greased with a mixture of cow and pig fat which would defile a Hindu and contaminate a Muslim equally. The company's officers tried to address the rumors. Some offered to allow soldiers to grease their own cartridges. Some changed the drill so that cartridges did not need to be bitten. None of these gestures touched the underlying conviction that had produced them. The belief, now widespread through the Bengal Army, that the company intended to destroy their religion and their caste, and that the cartridges were the instrument through which it planned to begin. The cartridges became the symbol of everything the previous decade had built. The explosion that followed was not about cartridges. The cartridges were simply what everything had been waiting for. On the evening of May 10, 1857, in the cantonment town of Meerut, 40 miles northeast of Delhi, 85 sepoys of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry, who had been imprisoned for refusing to use the Enfield cartridges, were broken out of jail by their comrades. The British officers who attempted to intervene were shot. The sepoys moved through the cantonment, killing Europeans and releasing Indian prisoners, and then turned toward Delhi. They arrived at the old Mughal capital the following morning. The pensionary emperor Bahadur Shah II, 82 years old, a poet, a calligrapher, the nominal last representative of Akbar's dynasty, was proclaimed Shahenshah-e-Hindustan, Emperor of Hindustan, by a tumultuous soldiery that he had not invited and could not control. The Mughal Empire had not existed as a functioning state for half a century. In the spring of 1857, it existed again for a few weeks, as a symbol, the one symbol that could draw together, under a single nominal authority, the disparate grievances of a continent. The rebellion spread with a speed that surprised both the company and later historians. Within weeks, mutinies had broken out through most of the Bengal Army's 74 native infantry regiments. The uprising moved through the cities and districts of the Upper Gangetic Plain, Lucknow, Kanpur, Jhansi, Bareilly, Ara, drawing in not just soldiers, but the dispossessed aristocracy of annexed states, the zamindars stripped of land by the revenue settlements, the cultivators exhausted by a century of extraction, the court servants of dissolved royal households who had no employment and no prospect of any. The rebellion was not a single thing. It was a convergence. Soldiers with professional grievances, princes with political ones, peasants with economic ones, communities with religious ones, all finding themselves in the summer of 1857 on the same side of the same line. Kanpur was the site of the rebellion's most consequential atrocities in the eyes of the British public. Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the last Maratha Peshwa, denied his pension by Dalhousie, commanded the rebel forces there. After a siege, the British garrison surrendered under a guarantee of safe passage. The boats provided for evacuation caught fire on the river, and in the chaos that followed, the surviving British men were killed. A group of British civilian captives held separately met a grim fate some days later, a tragic loss of life that became, in British public memory, the defining image of the rebellion. The event was genuinely atrocious. It was also deployed, with extraordinary speed and intensity, as a complete account of what the rebellion was, a savage uprising against innocent civilians, in place of the account that would have required engaging with its causes. The well at Kanpur became the justification for a suppression whose violence considerably exceeded the atrocities it was said to be punishing. Delhi held for 4 months. The siege of the city, which the company's forces maintained from a ridge to the north through a summer of heat and disease and continuous sorties by the rebel garrison, was a fight that could have gone the other way at multiple points. The company had only 35,000 British soldiers in the entire subcontinent when the rebellion began. Reinforcements from Britain took months to arrive. What stabilized the British position was the decision of the Sikhs and Punjabi Muslims, communities that had no affection for Mughal restoration and considerable recent experience of being conquered by the Bengal Army, to support the company against the rebellion. Delhi fell on the 18th of September, 1857, after 6 days of brutal urban fighting. Bahadur Shah II was found hiding in the tomb of Humayun, 2 miles from the Red Fort, arrested, tried, and exiled to Rangoon, where he died in 1862. His sons were executed without trial on the road from the tomb. The Mughal dynasty, which had governed most of India for 3 centuries, ended in a ditch beside a Delhi road on a September afternoon. The suppression of the rebellion took more than a year and involved violence on a scale that shocked even some of the British officers who participated in it. Rebels were hanged en masse. They were subjected to execution by artillery fire, a fatal measure that contemporary British accounts described as necessary and humane because it was swift. Villages in Awadh that had participated in the uprising were burned. The countryside around Lucknow and Kanpur was subjected to systematic, punitive operations that made little distinction between combatants and the communities from which they had come. Lieutenant Colonel James Neal at Allahabad, operating ahead of his orders and ahead of any confirmed news of British atrocities, conducted reprisals of such thoroughness that they became the subject of inquiry even at the time. The violence of the suppression did not restore order in any straightforward sense. It produced a submission that was different from order, a silence enforced by fear rather than a peace maintained by consent. The rebellion's geographic limits were as significant as its scope. Bengal, Madras, and Bombay remained largely calm. The Bombay Army's 29 regiments experienced 3 small mutinies. The Madras Army's 52 had none. South India, where the company's presence was older, its administrative methods more established, and the doctrine of Lapse's most recent victims fewer, did not rise. The large princely states, Hyderabad, Mysore, Travancore, Kashmir, whose rulers had made their accommodations with company paramountcy and understood that rebellion offered them nothing, remained loyal or passive. The Sikh rulers of the Punjab, conquered only a decade earlier, calculated that a Mughal restoration served their interests even less than company rule and provided troops and support to the British. The rebellion that nearly destroyed the company was the rebellion of one particular community of soldiers, in one particular presidency, at one particular moment of accumulated grievance. And it was suppressed, in part, by other communities whose interests the company had managed more carefully. The political consequence arrived quickly. Parliament had been watching the company's Indian governance with increasing unease for 30 years. The rebellion provided the occasion that opinion had been waiting for. The Government of India Act 1858 was passed in August of that year. It transferred all the company's powers, territorial, administrative, military, judicial, to the British Crown. A Secretary of State for India, answerable to Parliament, replaced the Court of Directors. A viceroy, appointed by the Crown, replaced the Governor-General appointed by the company. The company's armies were absorbed into the British Army, though the Indian regiments remained as the Indian Army, now under Crown command. On November 1, 1858, Queen Victoria issued a proclamation to the princes, chiefs, and peoples of India, promising religious tolerance, respect for existing treaty rights, equal treatment under the law, and no further annexation. Whether this proclamation was believed, in a subcontinent that had just been shown what the company did with promises, is another matter. The company itself lingered for 16 more years in vestigial form, continuing to manage a small amount of business on the Crown's behalf. On June 1, 1874, the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act dissolved it formally. The shareholders received their final payment. The organization that had been chartered on 31st December 1600 to trade in spices ceased to exist as a legal entity 273 years later, having in the interval conquered and governed a subcontinent, established the institutional templates of modern corporate governance, participated in 2 opium wars, produced 12 major famines, extracted wealth on a scale that has been variously estimated but never disputed in its direction, and, in its final year of active operation, provoked the largest armed uprising against colonial rule that the 19th century would produce. The name the rebellion is given still reflects the perspective from which it is observed. The British called it the Mutiny, the Sepoy Mutiny, the Indian Mutiny, frameworks that located it inside the company's institutional world and defined it primarily as a failure of military discipline. Indian nationalists later called it the First War of Independence, a framework that located it inside the history of Indian self-determination and defined it as the beginning of the end of foreign rule. Neither name is complete. The rebellion was a military mutiny that became a popular uprising that was defined by its specific social composition and its specific historical moment in ways that neither framework entirely captures. What it was, unambiguously, was the moment at which the accumulated consequences of a century of company rule became impossible to contain. The point at which the system that had been designed to extract from India without being accountable to India finally encountered a resistance it could not administer away. The Government of India Act of 1858 changed the name on the letterhead. It did not change the system that the company had built. The revenue settlements remained, the land tenure systems remained, the railway lines built to move goods from the interior to the ports remained. The drain of Indian wealth to Britain remained. The racial hierarchy that placed Europeans above Indians in every administrative and military structure remained. The Crown's India was the company's India, with the company removed. The same territory, the same revenues, the same institutional logic of extraction, the same absence of accountability to the people who lived under it. Queen Victoria became Empress of India in 1877. The empire she inherited had been assembled over 2.5 centuries by a joint stock corporation that had started out trying to sell spices and ended up ruling a continent. The conquest was real. The corporation that conducted it was gone. The consequences remained. In Rangoon, in 1862, Bahadur Shah II, the last Mughal emperor, the reluctant figurehead of a revolution he had not started and could not lead, died in exile. He was buried quietly, without ceremony the British were willing to sanction, in a grave whose location was kept secret for decades. He had written poetry throughout his captivity. One of his ghazals, composed in the months before his exile, contained a lament that has been translated many ways, but whose meaning in any translation is the same: that a man can spend his entire life in the garden of the world and still be refused so much as a breath of its fragrance in the moment of his dying. He had watched an empire end and been buried in a foreign country without even the consolation of a stone to mark where he lay. The East India Company had done this. It had done it trying to make money. It had succeeded at that, too. In 1600, the year the company received its charter, India produced roughly a quarter of the world's total economic output. The subcontinent was not a poor place. It was one of the 2 or 3 most productive economies on Earth, with a manufacturing base in textiles, steel, and shipbuilding that was sophisticated by any standard of the time, and an agricultural system that fed hundreds of millions of people and generated surpluses that had sustained commercial networks across the entire Indian Ocean world for centuries. When the historian Angus Maddison assembled the long-run data on global GDP, he found India's share hovering around 22 to 25% throughout the 17th century. By 1947, when independence came, India's share of world GDP had fallen to approximately 3.5%. 2.5 centuries of company and crown rule had taken the wealthiest major economy in the world and reduced it to one of the poorest. The question of how this happened is not one that admits a simple answer. The question of whether it happened is not seriously disputed. The most systematic attempt to quantify the extraction was made by the economist Utsa Patnaik, who spent years tracing the flows of tax revenue and trade surplus through the colonial period from 1765 to 1938. Her methodology is contested by some economic historians, who argue that the framing of colonial extraction as a simple drain undervalues the complexity of colonial-era trade and the genuine economic services that some British investment provided. These are real objections, and the specific figure she arrives at, which she compounds to approximately $45 trillion in current value, should be understood as the upper bound of a serious argument rather than a settled accounting. What is not seriously contested is the direction. Wealth moved from India to Britain throughout the colonial period, consistently, structurally, and in quantities that far exceeded anything that moved the other way. The debate is about the precise magnitude of an injustice whose basic reality is beyond reasonable dispute. The mechanism that made this possible was not straightforward plunder, though there was plunder, most visibly in the aftermath of Plassey, when Clive and his colleagues removed the contents of Bengal's treasury and transferred them to London in a series of transactions whose total scale ran into millions of pounds. The sustained mechanism was more subtle and more structural. The company collected taxes from the Indian population. It then used a portion of those taxes to buy Indian goods, textiles, saltpeter, indigo, cotton, which it exported to Britain and sold at a profit. The profit returned to Britain. The taxes that had funded the purchase did not return to India. The Indian producers who had grown the cotton and woven the cloth had been paid, but paid from money that had been extracted from them in the first place, and the profit from the transaction accrued entirely elsewhere. India's export earnings generated wealth for the institution and the country that ran it, not for the country that produced the goods. The famine record is the most direct measure of what this extraction cost in human lives. The 1901 Famine Commission found 12 major famines and 4 severe scarcities in the 93 years of company rule between 1765 and 1858. The frequency and severity of famine under company rule was not matched by any comparable period of Indian history before or after. Under Crown rule in the second half of the 19th century, some estimates place famine deaths between 25 and 30 million. The connection between the revenue system and the famine record was understood at the time by Indian administrators who wrote about it, by British officials who documented it, by the famine commissions themselves, which produced detailed reports on the relationship between revenue demand, food security, and mortality. The knowledge was there. The system that produced the famines was not changed in response to it, because the system's primary function was not the welfare of the people who lived under it. The deindustrialization that accompanied company rule has left a particular mark on the historiography because it was so visible and so fast. In 1750, India was one of the world's great manufacturing nations. By 1900, it was largely an exporter of raw materials and an importer of finished goods, the precise reversal of its pre-colonial position. The fine cotton muslin of Dhaka, the sword steel of Mysore, the silk of Benares, the indigo of Bengal, industries that had existed for centuries and had supplied markets across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, were reduced to artisanal remnants or eliminated entirely within 2 or 3 generations. The mechanisms were not obscure. The revenue system redirected agricultural land from food crops to commercial ones. The trade policy privileged British manufactured goods over Indian handloom production. The company's political control allowed it to manage Indian markets in ways that served British industrial interests, which were not the same as Indian ones. The infrastructure that company and crown rule built, the railways, the telegraph, the postal system, the legal architecture of property rights and contract law, is sometimes cited as evidence that colonialism provided India with real economic benefits alongside its depredations. The argument deserves a careful answer rather than a dismissal. The railways were real, and they moved goods and people in ways that had not been possible before. The legal system created predictability in commercial relationships. Some of the administrative structures that the company built survived independence and continue to function. These are genuine legacies. They are also legacies that served the extraction logic first and Indian development second. The railways were built to carry cotton from the interior to the ports, not to connect Indian cities to each other for Indian commercial purposes. The legal system protected property rights, including the property rights of the company and its allies. The infrastructure of colonialism was infrastructure designed for colonialism. What was not built tells the story more clearly than what was. India in 1947 had one of the lowest rates of literacy in the world, well under 20%. It had almost no heavy industry of its own, no substantial engineering sector, no pharmaceutical industry, no advanced manufacturing of any kind. The railways moved goods, but the locomotives that pulled them were manufactured in Britain. The telegraph transmitted messages, but the equipment was built elsewhere. The administrative system trained clerks, but not engineers, civil servants, but not scientists. For nearly 2 centuries, the most productive economy on Earth was managed to produce raw materials and revenue for someone else. When independence came, the task of building the economy that colonialism had dismantled fell to the people who had survived it. The Crown's takeover in 1858 did not alter the fundamental structure of extraction. The permanent settlement remained. The revenue demand remained. The trade policies that privileged British manufacturers over Indian producers remained. India continued to run a large export surplus, sending more goods to the world than it received in return, and the earnings from that surplus continued to flow into British accounts as payment for the administrative and military costs of imperial governance. The British called this the home charges, the annual payment India made to Britain for the privilege of being governed by it. By the late 19th century, this figure amounted to tens of millions of pounds annually. India paid for its own conquest, its own administration, and its own suppression year after year through a mechanism so thoroughly normalized that it appeared in official accounts as a straightforward financial obligation. The final accounting cannot be expressed only in money. The 10 million dead in the Bengal famine of 1770, the 30 million who died in famines under Crown rule in the 19th century, the life expectancy that fell by 20% between 1870 and 1920, the precise period of British imperial confidence and expansion, the industries that did not develop, the universities that did not exist, the scientists and engineers and mathematicians who were not trained, the decisions about land use, crop cultivation, trade policy, and industrial development that were made in London for reasons that had nothing to do with Indian welfare. These are not abstract losses. They are the accumulated human cost of a system that treated a population of 200 million people as an instrument of commercial production for a century and a half, and that did so not through exceptional cruelty, but through the ordinary operation of institutional incentives that pointed in one direction only and never corrected themselves because there was nothing in their design that required them to. The company that began on 31st December 1600 with £72,000 of capital and a charter to trade in spices was dissolved on 1st June 1874 with a guaranteed dividend for its shareholders, paid from Indian revenues, that would run for another generation. Between those two dates, it had taken from India, in revenue, in trade surplus, in the personal fortunes of its servants, in the commercial advantages it created for British manufacturers at Indian manufacturers' expense, more than any institution in the history of the world had ever taken from any place in a comparable period of time. It had done this without planning to. It had done this by following, step by step, the institutional logic of a private corporation operating in conditions of no meaningful accountability to those it governed. It had done this because the system it built worked exactly as designed. And when it was dissolved, the system it built did not dissolve with it. It simply changed names. The East India Company left behind two kinds of legacy, and they pull in opposite directions. One is the legacy of what it did to India, the revenue systems, the deindustrialization, the famine record, the extraction of wealth on a scale that reshaped the global economy and left one of history's great civilizations impoverished at the moment of its own independence. That legacy is measurable, documented, and debated. The other legacy is less visible because it is not located in India at all. It is located in the structural history of the modern world, in the institutional innovations that the company pioneered and that the corporations which came after it inherited and extended. The joint stock company with limited liability, the separation of ownership from management, the professional civil service trained through examination rather than patronage, the modern financial market, whose earliest significant instrument was the company's own stock, traded on what became the London Stock Exchange. These are the company's other children, and they have outlasted everything else it built. The joint stock structure that the company helped pioneer was genuinely revolutionary in 1600, and its consequences for the organization of economic life are genuinely difficult to overstate. Before the permanent joint stock company, the accumulation of capital for long-term investment was severely limited by the lifespans of individual investors and the dissolution of partnerships on the death of a partner. The company structure allowed capital to persist beyond any individual's life, to grow across generations, to mobilize resources from thousands of investors who would never know each other or meet in pursuit of enterprises that no individual or small group could finance. This was the mechanism that made global trade possible at scale, and it is the mechanism that underlies every significant commercial enterprise in the modern world. When a pension fund purchases shares in a company whose operations span 50 countries, it is participating in a structure whose basic logic was worked out in a counting house in Leadenhall Street in the first years of the 17th century. The separation of ownership from management, the directors answering to the proprietors, the factors in India answering to the directors in London, created the first serious attempt to solve the problem that has occupied corporate governance ever since. How do you ensure that the people who run an organization act in the interests of the people who own it, rather than in their own interests? The company's answer was imperfect and frequently violated. Clive's personal fortune, the Nabobs' extracted wealth, the corruption of the dual system, all of these were failures of the governance structure the company had designed. But the structure was designed, and the design was new, and the century of argument about how to improve it produced the vocabulary and the institutions of modern corporate accountability. Limited liability, board oversight, shareholder voting, audited accounts. These are the company's institutional grandchildren, born from the failure of its original design as much as from its success. The Indian civil service that the company built in its final decades, selected by competitive examination, paid high fixed salaries to discourage corruption, required to remain committed to service rather than private trade, was itself a significant institutional innovation. It became the template for the British civil service reform of 1854, and through that reform for civil services across the democratic world. The idea that government administrators should be selected on merit rather than on connection, and that their salaries should be sufficient to make corruption economically irrational rather than structurally tempting, seems obvious now. It was not obvious before the company worked it out, through the painful experience of watching what happened when selection was made on connection and salaries were inadequate. The institution that produced the Bengal famine also, in its long institutional life, produced some of the mechanisms that modern democracies use to prevent the worst excesses of administrative power. The question of whether the Crown's takeover in 1858 was meaningfully different from what the company had been doing before, it is one that Indian historians have approached with varying conclusions. The administrative structures were the same. The revenue systems were the same. The racial hierarchies were the same. The drain of wealth continued through mechanisms that the Crown inherited and maintained. What changed was the constitutional form. India was now explicitly a colony of the British state, its governance directly accountable to Parliament rather than to a corporation's board of directors. The accountability was real but limited. Parliament could question the Viceroy. It could not vote to return the permanent settlements' revenues to the people from whom they had been taken. The transition from company rule to Crown rule was, in structural terms, the conversion of extraction from a corporate activity into a governmental one. The extraction itself did not change. The argument that colonial rule modernized India, that railways and telegraphs and legal systems and English education were net benefits that ought to be weighed against the costs, has been made seriously by serious historians and deserves a serious response. The response is not that these things had no value. It is that they were not provided as a gift. They were provided as instruments of the same extraction logic that produced the famines and the deindustrialization. The railways moved goods from Indian fields to British ships. The legal system protected British commercial interests. The English education produced administrators for the colonial state, not innovators for an independent economy. Every element of the modernization that colonialism provided was shaped by the purpose it was designed to serve, and that purpose was not Indian development. When India gained independence in 1947, it was the independent nation that had to invest in the development that colonialism had not. The contemporary resonance of the company's history is not a matter of direct parallel. No modern corporation is raising armies and collecting taxes from sovereign populations, at least not in any form that its legal structure openly acknowledges. The resonance is structural. The question the company poses is the question that every subsequent generation has had to answer in new forms. What happens when private power, power accountable to shareholders rather than to any sovereign constraint, is large enough and concentrated enough to shape the lives of populations that have no meaningful ability to hold it accountable? The company's answer, demonstrated across 2.5 centuries, was that unchecked corporate power tends toward extraction. It collects what it can from whoever cannot refuse, and it continues collecting until it is either constrained by a force strong enough to require different behavior, or until it has extracted so much that the thing it was extracting from ceases to function. This is not a description of evil. It is a description of a logic. The world that the East India Company helped create is the world we inhabit. The global trading system whose basic structure it pioneered. The corporate form whose governance problems it first demonstrated at scale. The legal and financial institutions whose origins trace partly through its history. The inequalities between the wealthy nations and the poor ones that colonial extraction helped produce and that persist in attenuated but recognizable form in the terms of trade, the terms of debt, and the terms of international governance that structure the current world. None of this means that the company's history is simply a mirror of the present. The differences matter. But the structural questions it raised about accountability, about the relationship between private profit and public obligation, about what happens when power operates without meaningful constraint, are not historical questions. They are live ones. The company did not set out to conquer India. It set out to make money. The conquest was the consequence of the logic it was following, not the purpose it had designed. This is the thing that makes it genuinely instructive rather than simply cautionary. A cautionary tale tells you something about unusual evil, about men or institutions that chose destruction when others would have chosen differently. The company's story is not that. The men who ran it were, in the main, not monsters. They were merchants and administrators and soldiers operating inside an institutional structure that rewarded extraction and punished restraint, that measured success in dividends and treated the welfare of the people it governed as a cost to be managed rather than an obligation to be met. They followed the logic they had been given. The logic produced Bengal. The logic produced the Doctrine of Lapse. The logic produced an opium empire and a famine record and the impoverishment of a civilization. The logic was not designed to produce these things. It was designed to produce returns for shareholders. The two turned out, in the conditions it operated, to be the same. On the 1st of June, 1874, the last shareholders received the last payment. The Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, 273 years old, briefly the most powerful institution on earth, long since reduced to a managing agency for someone else's empire, was dissolved by Act of Parliament without ceremony. No one attended its dissolution who had not been paid to be there. Its records went to the British Library, where they remain. Its territories went to the Crown, which governed them for another 73 years before handing them back. Its institutional innovations, the joint stock structure, the professional service, the financial markets, the corporate governance architecture, went into the world, stripped of their colonial origins, to form the skeleton of the modern global economy. The company was gone. What it had built was everywhere, and what it had taken was still missing, in the places from which it had been taken, in the ways that missing wealth is always missing, not as an absence you can point to, but as a future that was not allowed to arrive.